Chapter 1. The Blood Princess. When gods decide to birth a monster, they choose their vessels carefully. The screams echoing through the Imperial palace on that March night in 15 CE weren't just from childbirth. They were from the future. As Vipsania Agrippina pushed the child from her womb in the lavish bedchamber overlooking Rome, the midwives attending her couldn't have known they were delivering the most dangerous woman in human history. The baby girl who would emerge covered in blood and fury would grow up to seduce emperors, poison husbands, commit incest with her own son, and ultimately reshape the Roman Empire through systematic violence and sexual manipulation. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell to join us on this dark journey through history's most twisted family saga. But even before Agrippina the Younger drew her first breath, her destiny had been written in the blood of her ancestors. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was a family tree fertilized with murder, watered with poison, and pruned with assassination. Every branch dripped with the gore of eliminated rivals, and every leaf whispered secrets of forbidden desires and unnatural ambitions. Her grandfather was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, Augustus Caesar's most trusted general and the military genius who had secured the empire through brutal conquest. Her grandmother was Julia the Elder, Augustus's own daughter, whose sexual scandals had rocked Rome, and whose eventual exile for adultery had established the imperial tradition of destroying family members who became inconvenient. More significantly, her father was Germanicus Julius Caesar, the beloved military hero whose mysterious death in 19 CE would fuel conspiracy theories for generations. Germanicus had been everything Romans wanted in a leader: brave, intelligent, charismatic, and successful in expanding the empire's borders through calculated genocide of Germanic tribes. Where are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments below as we explore the bloodiest family in ancient history. But in the twisted logic of imperial succession, being perfect made Germanicus dangerous to his own family. His popularity with the legions and the people threatened Emperor Tiberius, who saw potential rivals everywhere and eliminated them with methodical precision. Young Agrippina would grow up hearing whispered stories about how her father had been poisoned on the orders of the very emperor he had served faithfully. She would learn that loyalty meant nothing when power was at stake, and that even the closest family bonds could be severed with a blade or a cup of wine laced with deadly herbs. Her mother, Vipsania Agrippina the Elder, became the template for everything the younger Agrippina would eventually become. Beautiful, intelligent, and ruthlessly ambitious, the elder Agrippina had turned her husband's death into a weapon against Tiberius, publicly accusing the emperor of murder while building a network of supporters who shared her hatred for the imperial family that had betrayed them. The elder Agrippina taught her children that survival in the imperial court required 3 essential skills: the ability to identify threats before they became fatal, the willingness to strike first when elimination became necessary, and the intelligence to make murder look like accident or natural causes. These lessons began when young Agrippina was barely old enough to walk. At age 3, she watched her mother conduct secret meetings with senators and military commanders, learning that politics was a game played in shadows with knives hidden behind smiles. She observed how her mother could shift from grief-stricken widow to seductive conspirator to righteous accuser within minutes, depending on which role served her purposes best. By age 5, Agrippina had witnessed her first poisoning when a family slave who had been suspected of spying for Tiberius died suddenly after eating food prepared specifically for him. Her mother explained calmly that sometimes people needed to die for the greater good of the family, and that showing mercy to enemies was the same as signing your own death warrant. The child absorbed these lessons with the natural intelligence that marked all members of her bloodline. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was planning betrayal: the slight shift in eye contact, the nervous gesture when discussing sensitive topics, the tendency to stand closer to exits during conversations. More importantly, she learned that her own beauty and charm were weapons more powerful than any sword. Even as a small child, Agrippina possessed the ethereal loveliness that characterized the women of her family: golden hair that caught light like spun metal, eyes the color of Mediterranean sapphires, and delicate features that suggested divine rather than human ancestry. But unlike other beautiful children who might have been content to be admired, Agrippina quickly discovered that her appearance could be used to manipulate adults into giving her whatever she wanted. She practiced different expressions in polished metal mirrors, learning which combination of innocence and seduction would work best on different types of men. She experimented with tears, discovering that they could transform anger into sympathy and punishment into reward. Most significantly, she learned that adults would reveal secrets to a beautiful child that they would never share with other adults. By age 7, Agrippina was already functioning as an informal spy for her mother, charming information from visitors and servants that proved invaluable in the family's ongoing war against Tiberius. But the most crucial lesson came when she was 8 years old and witnessed the systematic destruction of her own family. Tiberius, finally deciding that the elder Agrippina had become too dangerous to tolerate, ordered the arrest of both her and her eldest son Nero Julius Caesar on charges of treason. The charges were completely fabricated, but in the imperial system, accusations from the emperor were equivalent to convictions. Young Agrippina watched from a hidden alcove as Praetorian guards dragged her mother and brother from their home in chains. She heard her mother's final words to the family. "Remember everything, forgive nothing, trust no one, survive at any cost." The elder Agrippina would die on the prison island of Pandateria, officially from suicide but almost certainly from murder disguised as self-destruction. Nero Julius Caesar would be executed shortly afterward, again officially for suicide but actually for refusing to betray other family members under torture. The 8-year-old girl who witnessed this destruction underwent a psychological transformation that would shape everything she did for the rest of her life. The last traces of normal human empathy died in that moment, replaced by a cold intelligence focused entirely on survival and revenge. She realized that in the imperial system, there were only 2 types of people: those who killed and those who were killed. Everything else, love, loyalty, family bonds, moral principles, was luxury that could be abandoned when survival was at stake. More specifically, she understood that her mother had failed not because she lacked courage or intelligence, but because she had been too direct in her opposition to Tiberius. The elder Agrippina had fought her enemies openly, challenging them to public combat where superior resources would inevitably triumph. The younger Agrippina would never make that mistake. Instead, she would perfect the art of destruction through seduction, manipulation, and systematic elimination of threats. She would smile while planning murders, express love while administering poison, and demonstrate loyalty while preparing betrayal. But perhaps most significantly, she would learn to use her own family relationships, including the most forbidden ones, as weapons in her quest for ultimate power. The seeds of her eventual incestuous relationship with her own son were planted during these early years of trauma and loss. Having seen how quickly normal family bonds could be severed by violence, she began developing an obsessive need to control the people closest to her through whatever means necessary. If traditional love and loyalty were insufficient to guarantee survival, she would create bonds so intense and unnatural that breaking them would be psychologically impossible for her victims. As she entered adolescence in the imperial court, surrounded by luxury but knowing that death could come at any moment, Agrippina began developing the skills that would make her the most feared woman of her generation. She studied poison making with the same dedication other girls applied to music and poetry. She learned to read people's desires and fears with the precision of a military strategist analyzing enemy positions. She practiced seduction techniques that would allow her to control men twice her age and 10 times her physical strength. Most importantly, she began planning her own rise to power through a combination of strategic marriages, systematic elimination of rivals, and the cultivation of unnatural relationships that would bind her victims to her through psychological chains stronger than any physical restraint. By the time she reached adulthood, Agrippina had transformed from a traumatized child into something far more dangerous than any emperor who had ever ruled Rome. She had become a force of nature focused entirely on power, revenge, and the ultimate goal of creating an empire where she could never again be vulnerable to the whims of others. The Blood Princess was ready to begin her reign of terror, and Rome would never be the same. Chapter 2: The Emperor's Favourite. The golden doors of Emperor Caligula's private chambers opened with a whisper, revealing a scene that would have scandalized the most depraved corners of Rome's underworld. But for 16-year-old Agrippina, watching her brother transform into a living god was simply another lesson in the application of absolute power. Caligula reclined on a couch of ivory and silk. his naked body painted with gold dust that caught the light of 100 oil lamps. Around him, senators' wives performed acts that would have been considered criminal in any other context, but which became sacred rituals when commanded by divine imperial authority. "Sister," Caligula called without turning his head, his voice carrying the lazy satisfaction of someone who had discovered that human beings could be transformed into any shape he desired. "Come join us. I want to show you something beautiful." Agrippina approached with the fluid grace that had already made her the most desired woman in Rome, her silk stola rustling softly against the marble floor. At 16, she had achieved the perfect combination of youthful innocence and sophisticated sensuality that drove men to madness and women to desperate envy. But she was here neither as ornament nor participant. She was here as student, learning the ultimate lessons about power from the master himself. "What are you teaching me today, brother?" she asked, settling onto a cushion beside his couch with practiced elegance. Caligula smiled, the expression transforming his already handsome features into something approaching divine beauty. "I'm teaching you about the difference between influence and control. Watch carefully." What followed was a demonstration of psychological manipulation that surpassed anything Agrippina had previously witnessed. Caligula didn't simply command the people around him to perform degrading acts. He made them compete for the privilege of degrading themselves, then convinced them that their humiliation was actually a form of spiritual elevation. He spoke to them in honeyed tones about the sacred nature of imperial service, explaining how their willingness to abandon dignity proved their worthiness to exist in his divine presence. He rewarded the most enthusiastic participants with small gifts and public recognition, creating a system where moral collapse became a pathway to social advancement. Most brilliantly, he made each participant believe they were his special favourite, that their unique understanding of his divine nature set them apart from the other degraded figures surrounding them. "Do you see?" Caligula whispered to Agrippina as the performance continued around them. "Fear makes people obey, but shame makes them loyal. When you force someone to betray their own principles, they become psychologically dependent on you for validation. They can't escape because leaving would mean acknowledging what they've become." Agrippina absorbed the lesson with the focused intensity of a military strategist studying battlefield tactics. This was more sophisticated than anything her mother had taught her about manipulation. This wasn't just about identifying weaknesses or exploiting desires, this was about fundamentally reconstructing human psychology to create permanent psychological slavery. "But how do you know which degradations will be most effective?" she asked, genuinely curious about the technical aspects of the process. Caligula laughed, a sound like silver bells mixed with breaking glass. "You start with small compromises and gradually increase the stakes. Everyone has lines they swear they'll never cross, but those lines can be moved if you're patient enough. The key is making each step seem reasonable compared to what they've already accepted." Over the following months, Caligula made Agrippina his unofficial apprentice in the arts of imperial manipulation. He taught her how to identify the specific psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited in different types of people: the senator who craved respect, the merchant who desired social acceptance, the soldier who needed to believe his actions served a higher purpose. More importantly, he showed her how these vulnerabilities could be weaponized to create networks of control that extended throughout the empire. "Traditional power is limited by resources," he explained during one of their private tutorials. "You can only maintain so many legions, buy so many supporters, threaten so many enemies. But psychological power is infinitely renewable. The more shame and dependency you create, the stronger your position becomes." Agrippina proved to be a brilliant student. Within weeks, she was successfully manipulating minor court officials using techniques adapted from Caligula's methods. She would identify their deepest insecurities, then offer them opportunities to compromise their principles in exchange for imperial favour. A treasury official who worried about his intellectual reputation was seduced into embezzling funds, then kept loyal through fear of exposure. A military commander who prided himself on honour was gradually corrupted into ordering unnecessary executions, then bound to Agrippina through shared guilt. Most impressively, she began developing innovations on Caligula's basic techniques. Where her brother relied primarily on shame and fear, Agrippina discovered that forbidden desire could be an even more powerful tool for psychological enslavement. She learned to identify the secret fantasies that her targets had never dared pursue, then create opportunities for them to fulfill those fantasies under circumstances that made them permanently dependent on her discretion. The results were devastatingly effective. Within 6 months, Agrippina had built her own network of compromised officials and corrupted supporters, all bound to her through webs of shared guilt and forbidden pleasure. But the most significant aspect of her education came when Caligula began teaching her about the strategic use of family relationships as weapons of control. Blood ties are the strongest bonds humans possess, he explained during a particularly intensive lesson. But they can also be the most dangerous weaknesses if your enemies know how to exploit them. The solution is to transform family relationships into something so intense and unnatural that they become sources of strength rather than vulnerability. He demonstrated this principle through his own relationships with their sisters, Julia Drusilla and Julia Livilla. What began as normal sibling affection was systematically transformed into something far more complex and binding through the careful application of shared secrets, mutual dependencies, and gradually escalating intimacies. When family bonds become forbidden, Caligula explained, they also become unbreakable. No one can use normal family loyalty against you if your family relationships operate outside normal human categories, Agrippina understood immediately. The incestuous relationships that scandalized Roman society weren't aberrations of imperial power. They were strategic innovations that created psychological chains stronger than any legal or military authority. More importantly, she began developing plans for how these techniques could be applied to her own future family relationships, particularly with any children she might eventually bear. The education intensified when Caligula decided to make Agrippina his official partner in certain imperial functions. She began appearing at his side during public ceremonies, learning how to project divine authority to the masses while maintaining the intricate web of private manipulations that kept the imperial system functioning. She discovered that ruling an empire required simultaneously performing multiple contradictory roles: loving mother figure to the people, merciless destroyer of enemies, divine presence above human judgment, and calculating politician managing practical necessities. The psychological strain of maintaining these multiple identities would have broken most people, but Agrippina found it exhilarating. Each role was simply another tool in her expanding arsenal of control techniques. But perhaps the most valuable lesson came when she witnessed Caligula's assassination in 41 CE. The emperor who had seemed invincible, who had transformed human psychology itself into an instrument of power, was ultimately brought down by a simple conspiracy of disgruntled guards who struck when he was momentarily isolated from his protective networks. As Agrippina watched her brother's blood pool on the marble floor of the theatre entrance, she understood the fatal flaw in his approach to power. Caligula had been so focused on psychological control that he had neglected the basic physical realities of imperial survival. All the shame, dependency, and forbidden loyalty in the world meant nothing if your enemies could reach you with a blade when your guards weren't looking. The lesson was clear. True power required both psychological mastery and physical security, both networks of compromised supporters and reliable protection from direct violence. Standing over her brother's corpse while Praetorian guards debated which member of the imperial family to elevate as his successor, Agrippina began planning how she would avoid his mistakes while preserving his innovations. She would build psychological networks even stronger than Caligula's, but she would also ensure that those networks included people capable of eliminating physical threats before they could become fatal. Most importantly, she would create family relationships so intensely binding that betrayal would become literally unthinkable for the people closest to her. The apprenticeship was over. Now it was time to become the master. But first, she would need to survive the succession crisis that was about to tear the imperial family apart, and position herself for the long campaign that would eventually place her own son on the throne of Rome. The Blood Princess was about to become something far more dangerous, a master manipulator with divine ambitions and the skills necessary to achieve them. Chapter 3: Marriage and Murder. The wedding feast had been magnificent, but Agrippina was already planning her husband's funeral. As she reclined beside Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus at the head table, smiling graciously at the hundreds of guests celebrating their union, her mind calculated exactly how long he would need to live before his death could serve her purposes most effectively. 2 years, she decided. Long enough to establish her position in his household and bear the child who would become her ultimate weapon, but not so long that genuine affection might complicate the necessary elimination. Gnaeus was handsome enough in the brutish way that characterized Roman military aristocracy. Broad shoulders, strong jaw, the kind of confident bearing that came from commanding legions and expecting instant obedience. He was also wealthy, well-connected, and politically ambitious, exactly the combination of traits Agrippina needed for the next phase of her rise to power. More importantly, he was completely unaware that his new bride possessed the deadliest collection of skills in the Roman Empire. "You look pleased with yourself, wife," Gnaeus observed, leaning close enough that his wine-scented breath warmed her ear. "Are you so eager for our wedding night?" Agrippina turned to face him with the perfect expression of maidenly anticipation, mixed with sophisticated desire that she had practiced countless times in private. "I'm eager for everything our marriage will bring us, husband. I believe we can achieve remarkable things together." The double meaning sailed completely over his head, as she had known it would. Gnaeus possessed the kind of straightforward masculine intelligence that excelled at military strategy and political maneuvering, but remained blind to the subtle psychological warfare that Agrippina had mastered under Caligula's tutelage. He saw a beautiful young woman of impeccable breeding who would enhance his social status and bear his children. She saw a useful tool that would serve her purposes until it became more valuable dead than alive. The wedding night proceeded exactly as Agrippina had anticipated. Gnaeus approached their physical union with the same methodical competence he brought to administrative duties, thorough, efficient, and completely focused on achieving the desired outcome. He was neither brutal nor gentle, neither imaginative nor boring. He was simply adequate, which was precisely what Agrippina required. She needed to conceive quickly and establish her pregnancy before beginning the psychological groundwork that would eventually justify his elimination. A grieving widow carrying her dead husband's heir would possess far more political capital than a living wife sharing power with an inconvenient spouse. But more immediately, she needed to begin learning everything about Gnaeus's household, finances, political connections, and personal vulnerabilities. The marriage provided her with access to resources and information that would prove essential for her long-term plans. Over the following weeks, Agrippina threw herself into the role of devoted wife with the same systematic precision she had once applied to her studies of poison and manipulation. She charmed his friends, impressed his political allies, and endeared herself to his household staff through a careful combination of generosity and subtle intimidation. Most importantly, she began building her own network of supporters within his existing power structure. The key was identifying which servants, guards, and administrators possessed access to sensitive information or critical functions, then gradually making them more loyal to her than to their original master. The techniques were variations on methods Caligula had taught her, adapted for the specific challenges of domestic infiltration. She started with the kitchen staff, using a combination of gold coins and veiled threats to ensure their cooperation in any future projects involving food preparation. Then she moved on to Gnaeus's personal secretary, seducing him into sharing details about his master's correspondence and financial dealings. The bodyguards required more sophisticated handling. These were professional soldiers whose loyalty had been purchased with good pay and the promise of advancement. Agrippina couldn't simply buy them with gold or seduce them with beauty. She needed to convince them that their long-term interests lay with her rather than with Gnaeus. She accomplished this through careful manipulation of their career ambitions. Using information gathered from the secretary, she learned which guards harboured hopes of promotion to more prestigious positions. Then she began arranging for them to receive recommendations and opportunities that appeared to come from Gnaeus, but actually originated from her own growing network of contacts in the Imperial administration. Within months, several key members of Gnaeus's security detail owed their recent advancement to Agrippina's invisible assistance. They had no idea she was responsible for their good fortune, but they had developed a vague sense that their master's wife was somehow associated with positive developments in their careers. This association would prove crucial when the time came for Gnaeus to die in ways that his own guards failed to prevent. But the most delicate aspect of Agrippina's domestic campaign involved her pregnancy and the child who would emerge from it. She conceived within weeks of the wedding, exactly as planned, and the pregnancy proceeded smoothly through the summer and fall of 37 CE. But even as her body nurtured the developing infant, Her mind was already planning how that child could be shaped into the ultimate instrument of her ambitions. The baby would be born into one of Rome's most prestigious families, with bloodlines connecting him to both the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the traditional aristocracy. He would inherit wealth, status, and political connections that would make him a natural candidate for high office, potentially even imperial succession if circumstances could be arranged properly. More importantly, he would be raised from birth by a mother who understood exactly how psychological bonds could be manipulated to create unbreakable loyalty and dependency. Agrippina spent the months of pregnancy developing detailed plans for her son's education because she was somehow certain the child would be male. He would learn traditional Roman virtues like courage and leadership, but he would also be taught the subtle arts of manipulation and control that she had mastered. Most crucially, he would be shaped to see her not just as his mother, but as the center of his entire universe. She would create bonds between them so intense and unnatural that betraying her would become psychologically impossible for him. When he eventually achieved supreme power, and Agrippina was determined that he would, she would rule through him with authority more absolute than any emperor in Roman history. But first, she needed to eliminate the inconvenient father who stood between her and complete control over her son's development. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born on December 15th, 37th CE, amid auspicious omens that impressed even cynical Roman observers. The birth was easy, the child was healthy and beautiful, and astrologers proclaimed that his horoscope indicated a destiny involving supreme power and divine honours. Agrippina held her newborn son for the first time and felt something she had never experienced before, a love so intense it transcended normal human categories and approached religious devotion. This child would be hers in ways that no other person could ever be. He would love her, need her, and depend on her so completely that they would become essentially one person, inhabiting two bodies. But for that perfect bond to develop, Gnaeus had to be removed from the equation. The elimination began 6 months after the birth, when Lucius was old enough that his father's death wouldn't interfere with crucial early development, but young enough that he would have no memories of Gnaeus to complicate his relationship with his mother. Agrippina chose a method that combined her growing expertise in poison with her detailed knowledge of her husband's personal habits and vulnerabilities. Gnaeus suffered from periodic digestive problems that he treated with a particular herbal remedy prepared by his personal physician. The remedy was bitter enough that small amounts of additional substances could be added without detection, and the symptoms of poisoning would be indistinguishable from a severe flare-up of his existing condition. The process took 3 weeks. Small doses of carefully selected toxins, administered irregularly to avoid obvious patterns, gradually weakening his system while producing symptoms that seemed like natural illness. Agrippina played the role of concerned wife perfectly, nursing him tenderly and summoning the best physicians in Rome to treat his mysterious ailment. When Gnaeus finally died in apparent agony, calling out for his beloved wife to save him, Agrippina's grief was so convincing that even she almost believed it was genuine. The funeral was a magnificent affair attended by half the Roman Senate. Agrippina appeared in mourning robes, clutching her infant son while tears streamed down her face in perfect streams that enhanced rather than diminished her ethereal beauty. She delivered a eulogy praising Gnaeus as the ideal Roman husband and father, a man whose only fault was loving his family too much to concern himself adequately with his own health and safety. The performance was so effective that several senators approached her afterward with offers of marriage, convinced that such a devoted wife would be a prize worth pursuing despite the scandal of competing for a widow's affections before her husband's ashes had cooled. But Agrippina had no intention of remarrying immediately. She had achieved exactly what she needed: control over significant financial resources, a son with impeccable bloodlines, and the sympathetic status of tragic young widowhood that would open doors throughout Roman society. Most importantly, she now had complete authority over her child's upbringing and education. There would be no father figure to interfere with the psychological bonds she intended to create, no competing source of love and loyalty to dilute her influence over her son's developing personality. As she stood over Gnaeus's grave-holding baby Lucius, Agrippina felt the satisfaction of someone who had executed a perfect plan. The first phase of her ultimate strategy was complete. Now came the more challenging task of positioning herself for marriage to an emperor while simultaneously shaping her son into the monster who would eventually rule the known world under her absolute control. The Blood Princess had become a mother, and that transformation would prove to be the most dangerous development in Roman history. Chapter 4. The Exile's Return. The ship that carried Agrippina back from Pontia appeared on the horizon like a harbinger of doom, its black sails cutting through the morning mist as if the underworld itself was delivering its most dangerous daughter back to Rome. 3 years of exile had transformed the already lethal young widow into something far more terrifying. A woman who had spent every moment of banishment planning her revenge against everyone who had dared to oppose her. Emperor Claudius stood on the palace balcony watching the vessel approach, his hands trembling with the palsy that afflicted him in moments of extreme stress. Beside him, his advisors exchanged nervous glances, all of them understanding that Agrippina's return would fundamentally alter the balance of power in ways none of them could fully predict or control. Perhaps, suggested Narcissus, Claudius's most trusted secretary, it would be wise to arrange for her ship to encounter difficulties before she reaches port. Claudius considered the suggestion seriously. It would be simple enough to arrange: a few loyal sailors, a conveniently timed fire or collision, the tragic loss of a returning exile who had been granted imperial mercy. No one would question the story, and Rome would be permanently freed from the threat she represented. But as he watched the ship draw closer, Claudius found himself remembering the 17-year-old girl who had once charmed him with her intelligence and beauty, who had seemed to genuinely care for her elderly uncle during family gatherings. Could that person truly have become the monster his advisors described? The answer became clear the moment Agrippina stepped onto the dock. She had always been beautiful, but exile had refined her loveliness into something approaching divine perfection. 3 years of careful diet, exercise, and cosmetic treatments had sculpted her body into an idealized representation of feminine grace. Her golden hair caught the morning sunlight like spun metal. Her sapphire eyes seemed to hold depths that promised both salvation and damnation, and her movements possessed a fluid elegance that made everyone around her appear clumsy by comparison. But it was her expression that revealed how completely she had changed during her banishment. The old Agrippina had been dangerous because she possessed intelligence, ambition, and few moral constraints. The new Agrippina was dangerous because she had transcended normal human psychology entirely. Her face showed no trace of anger, fear, or uncertainty, only the serene confidence of someone who had achieved perfect clarity about her purpose and methods. She was no longer a woman seeking power. She was power itself, wearing human form and returning to claim what belonged to it by divine right. The crowd that had gathered to witness her return fell silent as she walked through them, her presence somehow making the morning air seem heavier and more charged with potential violence. Even hardened soldiers found themselves stepping aside without conscious decision, responding to an aura of authority that transcended military rank or political position. When Agrippina reached the palace gates, she paused just long enough to look up at the balcony where Claudius waited, and the smile she directed toward him contained promises that made his blood freeze in his veins. "Uncle," she called out in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard despite its soft tone, "how kind of you to welcome me home personally. I have so much to tell you about everything I learned during my educational journey." The words themselves were innocuous, but their delivery conveyed layers of meaning that everyone present understood on a subconscious level. This was not a humbled exile returning to beg forgiveness. This was a predator announcing its intention to reclaim territory that had been temporarily occupied by lesser creatures. Over the following days, Agrippina began implementing the comprehensive strategy she had developed during her years of banishment. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication, involving simultaneous manipulation of dozens of different individuals and institutions throughout Roman society. The first phase involved establishing her new household and demonstrating that her period of disgrace had only enhanced rather than diminished her capabilities. She purchased a magnificent villa on the Palatine Hill, furnished it with treasures acquired during her exile, and began hosting gatherings that quickly became the most sought-after social events in Rome. But these weren't ordinary dinner parties. They were carefully orchestrated performances designed to showcase Agrippina's evolution from dangerous young woman into something approaching a force of nature. Guests found themselves participating in conversations that revealed their deepest secrets and most vulnerable desires, often without realizing what they were revealing. Agrippina had perfected techniques for extracting information that made previous forms of interrogation seem crude and obvious by comparison. She would begin with innocent questions about family, career, or personal interests, then gradually guide the conversation toward more sensitive topics through such subtle transitions that her targets never noticed they were being manipulated. Within hours, senators were confessing political ambitions they had never shared with their wives. Merchants were revealing financial irregularities they had hidden from their partners, and military commanders were discussing strategic concerns that should have remained absolutely confidential. More significantly, Agrippina used these gatherings to identify potential allies and enemies with scientific precision. She categorized every person she encountered based on their psychological vulnerabilities, political usefulness, and potential threat level, then developed specific strategies for neutralizing threats while maximizing benefits from allies. The second phase involved reconnecting with her son Lucius, who had been raised by guardians during her exile, and was now a precocious 4-year-old with disturbing similarities to his mother's intelligence and charisma. Their reunion was carefully staged to create maximum emotional impact. Agrippina arranged to encounter the child accidentally while he was playing in the palace gardens, then swept him into her arms with tears of joy that appeared completely genuine to everyone present. "My beautiful boy," she whispered loud enough for nearby servants to hear, "Mama has missed you so much." "Did you miss me too?" Little Lucius looked into her eyes with the kind of intense focus that characterized their family bloodline, and his response would be remembered by witnesses for the rest of their lives. "I dreamed about you every night," he said in his clear child's voice. "You told me you would come back when it was time to teach me important things." The exchange sent chills through everyone who heard it, not because of what was said, but because of the unmistakable implication that mother and son shared some form of psychic connection that had persisted throughout their separation. Over the following weeks, Agrippina began the systematic reconstruction of her relationship with Lucius, applying psychological techniques that were sophisticated even by her own standards. She didn't simply shower him with affection and gifts. She created a carefully controlled environment where his entire sense of identity and self-worth became dependent on earning her approval. The process was subtle enough that observers saw only a devoted mother reconnecting with her beloved child, but Agrippina was actually implementing the first stages of the psychological conditioning that would eventually make it impossible for Lucius to conceive of existence without her as the center of his universe. The third phase of her return strategy involved the systematic elimination of everyone who had been responsible for her exile or who might oppose her future plans. This couldn't be accomplished through direct violence, which would have been too obvious and would have united her enemies against her. Instead, she began a campaign of psychological warfare and strategic manipulation that gradually destroyed her targets through their own actions and decisions. The techniques were masterful variations on methods Caligula had taught her, enhanced by innovations she had developed during her years of enforced contemplation. She would identify each target's specific weaknesses: gambling debts, sexual indiscretions, political misjudgments, family scandals, then create situations where those weaknesses became publicly exposed in ways that appeared completely accidental. A senator who had supported her exile found himself facing charges of corruption after documents mysteriously appeared linking him to illegal financial dealings. A military commander who had testified against her during her trial was discovered in a compromising position with another man's wife, destroying his reputation and career. A court official who had handled her case was revealed to have been embezzling funds from the Imperial treasury for years. Each destruction appeared to be the result of natural consequences catching up with corrupt individuals. No one could prove that Agrippina was involved, but the pattern was clear to anyone with the intelligence to recognize it. Opposition to her was a fatal mistake that would eventually be punished with mathematical precision. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Agrippina's return was how she began positioning herself for the ultimate prize: marriage to Emperor Claudius himself. This was the most audacious goal imaginable. Claudius was her uncle, making any romantic relationship technically incestuous and legally forbidden under traditional Roman law. He was already married to Valeria Messalina, who held the position of empress and had borne him children. Most importantly, he was supposedly immune to the kind of sexual manipulation that had proven effective against younger, more impulsive men. But Agrippina had spent 3 years studying Claudius from a distance, analysing his psychological profile with the same systematic attention she had once applied to military strategy. She understood his intellectual vanity, his physical insecurities, his desperate need for validation from people he respected, and his secret fascination with women who combined beauty with genuine intelligence. More crucially, she had developed a plan for eliminating Messalina in ways that would leave Claudius emotionally vulnerable and psychologically dependent on whoever offered him comfort during his period of grief and confusion. The plan was so comprehensive and sophisticated that it would take months to implement properly. But as Agrippina settled into her new villa and began rebuilding her networks of support and influence, she felt the satisfaction of someone who had transformed a devastating defeat into the foundation for ultimate victory. The exile was over. The real conquest was about to begin. And when it was complete, Agrippina would possess power that no woman in human history had ever achieved. Absolute control over the Roman Empire through her domination of both an emperor husband and an imperial son who would be shaped into the perfect instrument of her divine ambitions. Chapter 5. Seducing the Emperor. The letter arrived at Claudius's private study hidden inside a scroll of philosophical writings, delivered by a servant so ordinary that no one would remember seeing him even moments after he departed. But the message inside would haunt the emperor's dreams and transform his understanding of desire, power, and the dangerous woman who had somehow learned to weaponize both. "Dearest uncle," it began in Agrippina's elegant script, "I have been reading Seneca's treatises on the nature of wisdom, and find myself wondering if true philosophy requires the courage to pursue knowledge that others fear to seek. Perhaps you might help me understand certain mysteries that seem beyond my feminine comprehension." The words were carefully chosen to appeal to Claudius's intellectual vanity, while suggesting depths of meaning that made his pulse quicken despite his efforts to remain detached. This wasn't the crude seduction attempt he might have expected from a less sophisticated woman. This was an invitation to explore forbidden territories of thought and experience with someone who might actually be worthy of his attention. More dangerously, it was the beginning of a campaign that would systematically exploit every psychological vulnerability Claudius possessed, while making him believe that he was the one controlling the relationship. Over the following weeks, a carefully orchestrated series of accidental encounters began occurring throughout the palace complex. Agrippina would appear in the library when Claudius was researching historical texts, always carrying books that related to his current interests and ready to engage in discussions that revealed her surprising depth of knowledge about subjects ranging from military strategy to religious philosophy. She never approached him directly or made any obvious attempts at flirtation. Instead, she positioned herself as an intellectual companion who happened to be devastatingly beautiful, creating a combination that proved more intoxicating than any purely physical attraction could have been. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding Caesar's campaigns in Gaul," she mentioned during one of these encounters, settling gracefully onto a nearby couch with a manuscript in her hands. "Your insights about his tactical innovations were fascinating, but I wonder if you've considered how his methods might apply to other forms of conquest." The double meaning was subtle enough to maintain plausible innocence while being obvious enough to send electric shocks through Claudius's nervous system. He found himself obsessing over these conversations for hours afterward, analysing every word and gesture for hidden significance, while trying to convince himself that he was imagining the sophisticated sexual tension that seemed to permeate their interactions. But Agrippina's strategy went far deeper than simple intellectual seduction. She had spent months studying Claudius's relationship with his wife Messalina, identifying the specific ways that marriage had become a source of frustration and humiliation rather than satisfaction and support. Messalina was beautiful and sexually adventurous, but she was also reckless, politically naive, and increasingly contemptuous of her husband's physical limitations and scholarly interests. She made no effort to hide her affairs with younger, more physically impressive men, and she actively mocked Claudius's attempts to engage her in serious conversations about literature, history, or philosophy. More significantly, she had begun using her position as empress to pursue personal vendettas and accumulate wealth in ways that threatened the stability of the imperial administration. Her excesses were becoming impossible to ignore, and Claudius was privately beginning to question whether his marriage was sustainable in the long term. Agrippina positioned herself as everything Messalina was not, intellectually stimulating rather than intellectually dismissive, politically sophisticated rather than recklessly impulsive, and genuinely interested in Claudius as a person rather than simply as a source of wealth and status. But perhaps most effectively, she created an atmosphere of emotional intimacy that Claudius had never experienced with any other person. During their conversations, she would ask him about his childhood, his scholarly interests, his hopes for his legacy as emperor. She listened to his responses with the kind of focused attention that made him feel truly understood for the first time in his adult life. When he shared his insecurities about his physical limitations or his concerns about governing effectively, she responded with insights that were both comforting and genuinely helpful. "You think too much about what others expect from an emperor," she told him, during one particularly intimate discussion. But the greatest leaders in history were those who had the courage to define power in their own terms rather than accepting definitions imposed by others. The psychological effect was intoxicating. Claudius began looking forward to their encounters with an intensity that surprised and somewhat alarmed him. He found himself arranging his schedule to maximize opportunities for accidental meetings, and he began experiencing a kind of emotional dependency that made him uncomfortable when too many days passed without seeing her. But the true genius of Agrippina's strategy was how she handled the growing sexual tension between them without ever acknowledging it directly. She would position herself during their conversations in ways that displayed her physical beauty to maximum advantage. The graceful curve of her neck when she leaned forward to examine a manuscript, the way candlelight caught the gold threads in her stola and made her skin seem to glow with inner radiance, the subtle perfume that lingered in the air after she departed and made Claudius's private study seem empty and lifeless by comparison. More significantly, she began incorporating subtle physical touches into their interactions. A hand briefly placed on his arm to emphasize a point, fingers that brushed against his when she handed him a scroll, moments when she stood close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. These contacts were always brief and seemingly innocent, but they created a growing sense of physical awareness that made Claudius hyper-conscious of her presence and hungry for opportunities to experience more sustained intimacy. The campaign reached its crucial phase when Agrippina began sharing carefully selected secrets that created the illusion of a mutual trust and conspiracy between them. "I probably shouldn't tell you this," she whispered during one of their library encounters, "but I've heard disturbing rumors about certain senators who may be planning to challenge your authority. Perhaps someone with your wisdom and experience could help me understand whether these concerns are justified." The information she provided was accurate enough to be valuable, but incomplete enough that Claudius felt compelled to seek additional details through further conversations with her. More importantly, by framing herself as his confidential source of intelligence about potential threats, she positioned herself as an essential partner in maintaining his political security. Within weeks, Claudius found himself sharing government secrets with Agrippina that he had never discussed with his official advisors. He began consulting her about policy decisions, seeking her opinions on personnel appointments, and relying on her insights about the political implications of various imperial actions. The transformation was so gradual that he never consciously recognized how completely his decision-making process had become dependent on her input and approval. But the final stage of the seduction required eliminating the obstacle that Messalina represented, and Agrippina had been preparing for this necessity since the beginning of her campaign. The plan she implemented was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that turned Messalina's own reckless nature into the instrument of her destruction. Using carefully placed rumors and strategic misinformation, Agrippina convinced Messalina that Claudius was planning to divorce her and marry a younger woman who would be more politically useful for his long-term dynasty plans. The rumors were crafted to trigger Messalina's worst fears about abandonment and replacement, while suggesting that desperate action might be necessary to preserve her position. Messalina's response was exactly what Agrippina had predicted. She entered into a bigamous marriage with Gaius Silius, one of Rome's most prominent young politicians, believing that this alliance would give her the political support necessary to maintain her imperial status even if Claudius attempted to discard her. The marriage was technically treasonous since it challenged the emperor's exclusive claim to his wife's loyalty and potentially threatened the legitimacy of imperial succession. When evidence of the ceremony was presented to Claudius, he had no choice but to order Messalina's execution for adultery and treason. As Claudius mourned the destruction of his marriage and struggled with the loneliness that followed Messalina's death, Agrippina was perfectly positioned to offer the comfort and companionship he desperately needed. The intellectual partnership they had developed provided the foundation for deeper emotional intimacy. The physical attraction that had been building for months finally had an opportunity for expression. Most importantly, the political alliance they had created made their marriage seem like a natural and beneficial development for the empire as well as for their personal happiness. When Claudius finally proposed marriage to his niece, he believed the decision was entirely his own, the natural result of finding genuine love and partnership with a woman who understood him as no one else ever had. He had no idea that every aspect of their relationship, from their first conversation to their wedding night, had been planned and orchestrated by the most dangerous manipulator in Roman history. The seduction was complete, and Agrippina had achieved the impossible: marriage to an emperor who would give her access to unlimited power, while remaining convinced that he was the one in control of their relationship. But the conquest of Claudius was only the beginning. Now came the far more challenging task of eliminating him at exactly the right moment while ensuring that her son would inherit the throne she had won through the most sophisticated campaign of sexual and psychological manipulation in human history. Chapter 6. The Poisoner's Apprentice. The basement laboratory beneath Locusta's villa reeked of death in a dozen different varieties, some sweet, some bitter, some carrying the metallic tang that warned of internal hemorrhaging, others producing the acrid burn that preceded organ failure. But to Agrippina, breathing in this cocktail of lethal fragrances was like entering a temple dedicated to the most sacred art form in the Roman Empire, the elimination of inconvenient people through methods that left no obvious traces of murder. "Welcome to my workshop, Empress," Locusta said, with the kind of professional pride that master craftsmen reserved for their finest students. "I trust you're prepared to learn techniques that will make your previous efforts seem crude and amateurish by comparison." Agrippina moved through the laboratory with the fluid grace that had become her trademark, examining the hundreds of glass containers, distillation apparatus, and botanical specimens that lined the walls. Each item represented years of experimentation and refinement, the accumulated knowledge of Rome's most accomplished poison maker distilled into a collection that could eliminate armies if properly applied. "Show me everything," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "I need to understand not just what kills, but how to make death appear natural, gradual, or accidental depending on circumstances." What followed was an education in systematic murder that surpassed anything previously available to even the most sophisticated practitioners of imperial violence. Locusta had spent decades perfecting techniques that combined botanical knowledge, chemical expertise, and psychological insight to create elimination methods that were virtually undetectable by contemporary investigative abilities. The basic principles were more complex than Agrippina had anticipated. Simple poisons that killed quickly were useful for emergency situations, but they inevitably created suspicion that could lead to dangerous investigations. The true art lay in substances that produce symptoms indistinguishable from natural diseases, allowing murders to be disguised as tragic but unremarkable deaths from common ailments. "Consider aconitine," Locusta explained, handling a vial of clear liquid with the reverence appropriate for something capable of ending human life in minuscule quantities. Derived from wolfsbane, it produces symptoms identical to heart failure. The victim experiences chest pain, difficulty breathing, and eventual cardiac arrest. Exactly what you would expect from natural causes in an older man with a history of stress and poor health. Agrippina absorbed these lessons with the focused intensity of a military strategist studying battlefield tactics. But she also began developing innovations that impressed even Locusta with their sophistication and psychological insight. Where traditional poisoners focused primarily on the technical aspects of elimination, which substances, what dosages, how to administer them without detection, Agrippina understood that the most effective murders were those that occurred within carefully constructed narratives that made them appear not just natural, but inevitable. The key, she explained during one of their sessions, is creating circumstances where the victim's death serves everyone's interests except his own. When people want someone to die, they become remarkably uninterested in investigating whether his death was actually natural. She demonstrated this principle through her approach to eliminating potential rivals for imperial succession. Rather than simply poisoning them and hoping their deaths would appear accidental, she first created political situations where their continued existence became problematic for multiple powerful individuals. Marcus Junius Silanus, for example, was a descendant of Augustus with a legitimate claim to imperial authority. Instead of killing him immediately, Agrippina first orchestrated a series of incidents that made him appear politically unreliable and potentially treasonous. She arranged for him to be present at suspicious meetings, ensured that his financial records showed irregularities that could be interpreted as corruption, and gradually built a case that he represented a threat to imperial stability. Only after establishing this narrative framework did she arrange for his death through a carefully administered dose of digitalis that produced symptoms consistent with a stress-induced heart attack brought on by his growing political difficulties. The result was a death that everyone accepted as natural and appropriate, a weak man whose treasonous ambitions had literally frightened him to death when he realized the consequences of opposing imperial authority. But Agrippina's most significant innovation involved developing poisons that could be administered gradually over extended periods, allowing for precise control over the timing of death, while creating symptoms that appeared to be progressive natural illness. Chronic arsenic poisoning, she explained to Locusta during one of their advanced sessions, produces symptoms that mimic dozens of different natural conditions: digestive problems, skin discoloration, hair loss, fatigue, confusion. Any competent physician would diagnose liver disease, kidney dysfunction, or simple aging, depending on which symptoms we choose to emphasize. The technical challenge lay in calculating dosages that would produce the desired progression of symptoms without killing the victim prematurely or allowing him to recover sufficiently to become suspicious about his condition. Agrippina solved this problem through systematic experimentation on slaves and condemned criminals, using them as test subjects to refine her understanding of how different bodies responded to various substances under different conditions. The experiments were conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all aspects of her approach to murder. Subjects were categorized by age, health status, diet, and physical condition, then exposed to different substances in carefully measured amounts, while detailed records were kept of their symptoms and eventual deaths. Subject 17, read one of her laboratory notebooks, male, approximately 50 years old, generally healthy but showing signs of stress-related digestive problems. Initial dose of 0.3 grains arsenic trioxide administered in wine, followed by 0.2 grains daily for 14 days. Symptoms progressed from mild stomach discomfort to severe cramping, skin discoloration, and hair loss. Death occurred on day 21 from apparent liver failure. Conclusion: effective for simulating natural decline in older male subjects with existing health concerns. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Agrippina's education was her development of poisons specifically designed to target different types of victims based on their psychological and social vulnerabilities. For political rivals who needed to appear weak and incompetent before dying, she created substances that produced gradual mental deterioration, memory loss, confusion, paranoid delusions that destroyed their credibility while making their eventual deaths seem like merciful releases from tragic illness. For family members whose deaths needed to appear particularly natural and uninvestigated, she developed combinations of substances that exploited existing medical conditions to accelerate natural disease processes in ways that appeared completely organic. Most sophisticated of all were poisons designed for victims who might be expecting assassination attempts. These substances were virtually tasteless, odorless, and colorless, but they could be administered through skin contact, inhaled vapors, or absorption through clothing or bedding, making it impossible for potential targets to protect themselves through careful food and drink precautions. As her education progressed, Agrippina began planning the systematic elimination of everyone who stood between her son and imperial succession. The list was extensive: dozens of potential claimants, political rivals, and influential individuals who might oppose Lucius's elevation to power when the time came. But the crown jewel of her assassination strategy remained the planned murder of Claudius himself, an operation that would require the perfect combination of technical expertise, psychological manipulation, and strategic timing to ensure that his death appeared natural while occurring at exactly the moment when it would maximize her son's chances of succeeding him. The planning for Claudius's elimination began with detailed analysis of his eating habits, medical history, daily routines, and personal relationships. Agrippina needed to understand not just how to kill him, but how to ensure that his death occurred under circumstances that would prevent any serious investigation while creating maximum political advantage for her family. His favourite dish is mushrooms prepared with garum, she noted during one planning session. He's particularly fond of Caesar's mushrooms served at dinner parties, and he always insists on having the largest and most perfectly prepared specimens. The dish is complex enough that additional ingredients could be incorporated without detection, and rich enough that any unusual flavours would be attributed to sophisticated seasoning. But the true genius of her plan lay not in the poison itself, but in the comprehensive strategy she developed for managing the aftermath of Claudius's death to ensure Lucius's smooth succession to imperial power. Every detail was calculated with mathematical precision, which senators would need to be eliminated or compromised before the assassination, which military commanders would need to be secured through bribes or threats, which members of the imperial family would need to be neutralized to prevent competing claims to the throne. As she completed her education in Locusta's laboratory and prepared to implement the most audacious murder in Roman history, Agrippina felt the satisfaction of someone who had mastered the ultimate art form. She had learned to kill with the precision of a surgeon, the creativity of an artist, and the strategic vision of a military genius. More importantly, she had developed the ability to transform murder itself into a tool of political construction, using systematic elimination to clear the path for her son's rise to divine power. The poisoner's apprentice had become the master, and Rome would never be the same. Chapter 7. The Golden Mushroom. The dinner party on October 13th, 50th CE was everything Agrippina had planned it to be: intimate, elegant, and perfectly orchestrated to become the most significant meal in Roman history. Only 12 guests had been invited to dine with Emperor Claudius in his private chambers, each one carefully selected for their ability to serve as credible witnesses to what would appear to be a tragic but entirely natural death from food poisoning. But as servants carried steaming platters of delicacies into the candlelit dining room, only one person present understood that they were about to witness the culmination of the most sophisticated assassination plot ever conceived. Claudius reclined on his dining couch in obvious good spirits, his scholarly face animated with pleasure as he discussed the evening's menu with his guests. At 63, he remained intellectually sharp despite the physical limitations that had plagued him throughout his life, and he took genuine delight in the elaborate culinary presentations that his kitchen staff had prepared for the occasion. "Tonight we have a special treat," he announced with the enthusiasm of someone sharing exciting news with dear friends. "My cooks have prepared Caesar's mushrooms using a recipe that supposedly dates back to Julius Caesar himself. The mushrooms were gathered this morning from the emperor's private forest, and they've been prepared with the finest garum and aged wine." Agrippina smiled with perfect warmth as she listened to her husband's excited description, playing the role of devoted wife with the same flawless precision that had characterized every aspect of their relationship. But inside, her mind calculated timing with the precision of a military strategist, coordinating a complex battlefield operation. The mushrooms Claudius described so enthusiastically had indeed been gathered that morning, but not by ordinary servants. Locusta herself had personally selected each specimen, choosing the largest and most perfect examples of Amanita caesarea, while carefully incorporating carefully prepared specimens of Amanita phalloides that had been treated with special techniques to eliminate their naturally bitter taste. More significantly, the ancient recipe being used for their preparation included ingredients that would mask the symptoms of Amanita poisoning while accelerating its effects, a combination of herbs and spices that Agrippina had developed through months of experimentation and that would ensure Claudius's death occurred within hours rather than the days that natural Amanita poisoning typically required. "The presentation is magnificent," commented Senator Valerius Asiaticus, examining the elaborate platter that servants had placed at the centre of the dining area. "I've never seen mushrooms prepared with such artistry." The compliment was entirely justified. Locusta had exceeded even her own standards in creating a dish that was simultaneously beautiful and deadly, arranging the poisoned mushrooms alongside perfectly safe specimens in patterns that ensured only Claudius would consume the lethal varieties, while making the selection appear completely random. As the emperor reached eagerly for the largest and most perfectly prepared mushroom on the platter, Agrippina felt a moment of something approaching genuine affection for the man she was about to murder. Claudius had been kind to her in his own way, had given her access to power beyond anything she could have achieved independently, and had genuinely loved her despite the manipulative foundation of their relationship. But sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford when her son's imperial destiny hung in the balance. Claudius's continued existence represented the primary obstacle to Lucius's succession, and obstacles existed to be eliminated regardless of personal feelings that might complicate necessary actions. "These are extraordinarily flavourful," Claudius observed, after consuming his first mushroom with obvious relish. "The preparation brings out subtle qualities that I've never noticed before. Agrippina, you must compliment the cooks on their exceptional work." "I certainly will, my dear," she replied smoothly, raising her wine cup in a toast to his discerning palate. "To your refined taste in all things, food, literature, and wives." The other guests laughed appreciatively at her gracious compliment, and the conversation continued in the relaxed, intimate atmosphere that characterized the emperor's private dinner parties. No one present had any reason to suspect that they were witnessing anything other than a pleasant evening among friends and family. As the meal progressed through multiple courses, Agrippina monitored Claudius's condition with the careful attention of a physician tracking a patient's response to treatment. The initial symptoms of amanita poisoning were subtle enough that they could easily be mistaken for the effects of rich food and aged wine: slight flushing, increased animation, a tendency toward more expansive gestures and louder conversation. But Agrippina recognized these signs as indicators that the poison was beginning to work its way through her husband's system, attacking his liver and kidneys while producing toxins that would soon overwhelm his body's ability to function normally. "I feel wonderfully energetic tonight," Claudius announced during the third course, his voice carrying the slight slur that his guests attributed to wine consumption, but which Agrippina understood was actually an early neurological symptom of the poison's effects. "Perhaps we should extend this gathering late into the evening. It's been too long since I've enjoyed such stimulating company and exceptional food." Several guests expressed enthusiasm for the suggestion, but Agrippina gently discouraged the idea while maintaining her role as considerate hostess. "You have important meetings tomorrow morning," she reminded him with loving concern. "Perhaps it would be wise to retire at a reasonable hour so you can be fully alert for your administrative duties." Her apparent consideration for his well-being was actually calculated to ensure that he would be alone in his private chambers when the poison's more dramatic effects began manifesting themselves. The carefully orchestrated dinner party needed to conclude before Claudius's condition became obviously medical rather than simply the result of enthusiastic dining. As the evening wound toward its planned conclusion, Claudius began displaying the restlessness and mild confusion that indicated the poison was approaching its critical phase. He stood and sat repeatedly, complained of feeling overheated despite the cool October air, and began having difficulty following the threads of conversation that had engaged him effortlessly earlier in the evening. "Perhaps I should escort you to your chambers," Agrippina suggested when his discomfort became obvious to the other guests. "You seem fatigued, and rest might help you feel more comfortable." Claudius accepted her assistance gratefully, leaning on her arm as she guided him away from the dining area, while their guests continued their conversations in the relaxed atmosphere of a successful social gathering. Once they were alone in his private chambers, Agrippina helped Claudius settle onto his sleeping couch while maintaining the performance of concerned wife that had convinced him of her devotion throughout their marriage. "I feel rather strange," he admitted, his voice now carrying the weakness that indicated systemic organ failure was beginning to accelerate. "Not ill exactly, just different, as if something inside me has shifted in ways I don't understand." "Perhaps you ate too enthusiastically," Agrippina suggested gently, placing a cool cloth on his forehead with tender care. "Rich food can sometimes affect digestion in unexpected ways. Rest will help your body process everything properly." But as she spoke these comforting words, Agrippina was actually monitoring the progression of symptoms that indicated amanita poisoning was entering its terminal phase. Claudius's skin had acquired a greyish pallor that suggested liver dysfunction. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, and his pupils were beginning to dilate in ways that indicated severe neurological compromise. Over the following hours, as Claudius slipped in and out of consciousness, While his body fought a losing battle against the toxins flooding his system, Agrippina maintained her vigil beside his bed while secretly coordinating the political maneuvers that would ensure her son's smooth succession to imperial power. Messages were sent to key military commanders confirming their loyalty to the imperial family. Senators who had been compromised through previous manipulations received reminders of their obligations to support the designated succession plan. Most importantly, arrangements were made to ensure that Lucius would be immediately available for coronation ceremonies once Claudius's death was officially announced. When Emperor Claudius finally died just before dawn, his passing appeared to be exactly what Agrippina had designed it to seem, the tragic but unremarkable death of an aging ruler whose system had been overwhelmed by rich food and the stress of imperial responsibilities. The physicians who examined his body found symptoms consistent with acute digestive distress brought on by dietary indiscretion. The witnesses who had attended the dinner party testified to his excellent spirits and healthy appetite throughout the evening. Even his closest advisers accepted the explanation that their emperor had simply succumbed to the kind of sudden illness that frequently claimed men of his age and position. No one suspected murder because no one had any reason to question the loving grief displayed by his devoted wife, who had lost a husband she appeared to adore and who faced an uncertain future as a widow in the dangerous world of imperial politics. But as Agrippina wept over Claudius's body with tears that seemed entirely genuine, she was actually experiencing the satisfaction of someone who had executed the perfect crime while simultaneously achieving the perfect political outcome. The golden mushroom had done its work with flawless precision. The path to the throne was now clear for her son, and she had eliminated the greatest obstacle to his imperial destiny without creating any suspicion that might threaten their family's claim to divine authority. The most sophisticated assassination in Roman history was complete, and a new era of imperial power was about to begin under the guidance of the most dangerous woman who had ever lived. But the death of Claudius was only the beginning of Agrippina's ultimate plan. Now came the far more challenging task of shaping her teenage son into the perfect instrument of her unlimited ambitions while ensuring that he remained psychologically dependent on her guidance for the rest of his life. The poisoner had become an empress mother, and Rome was about to discover what happened when unlimited power was placed in the hands of someone who viewed human relationships as tools to be manipulated and human lives as obstacles to be eliminated whenever they became inconvenient. Chapter 8. Mother of the Beast. The golden laurel crown settled onto 16-year-old Lucius's head like a divine blessing, but the expression in his eyes as he accepted the cheers of the Roman Senate revealed something far darker than imperial ambition. It was pure, undiluted hunger, the look of a predator that had finally been given permission to hunt without restraint. Standing beside the newly crowned Emperor Nero in the Senate House, Agrippina felt a surge of maternal pride mixed with something approaching religious ecstasy. After decades of planning, manipulation, and systematic murder, she had achieved the impossible, absolute power over the Roman Empire through complete control over the young man who would now rule the known world. But as she watched her son acknowledge the senator's acclaim with practiced grace, she also noticed subtle signs that suggested their relationship was about to enter uncharted territory. The way he held his head slightly higher than necessary, asserting dominance even over her. The brief glance he directed toward her that contained assessment rather than the automatic deference she had grown accustomed to receiving. Most significantly, the smile he wore during the ceremony, charming to observers but carrying an edge of independence that she had never seen before. Nero was no longer simply her obedient creation. He was becoming something else, something that might eventually challenge even her authority over him. "Citizens of Rome," Nero declared in his clear, cultured voice, "I accept this sacred responsibility with the humility appropriate to one chosen by the gods to guide our eternal city. But I also accept it with the strength necessary to ensure that Rome's glory continues to grow under my leadership." The words were perfect, appropriately modest yet confidently authoritative, demonstrating respect for tradition while promising dynamic leadership for the future. Agrippina had coached him in delivery techniques that would maximize the speech's impact, and his performance exceeded even her expectations. But she also detected subtle modifications he had made to the text they had prepared together, changes that shifted emphasis in ways that made his authority appear more independent and less dependent on maternal guidance. Over the following weeks, as Nero established himself in his role as emperor, these signs of growing independence became more pronounced and more troubling. He began making decisions without consulting her first, issuing orders that contradicted policies they had previously agreed upon, and surrounding himself with advisors who owed their positions to him rather than to her. Most significantly, he started displaying the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he was testing the limits of his newfound power in ways that went beyond anything Agrippina had taught him. "I want to see how they die," he announced during one of their private conversations, referring to a group of criminals who had been condemned to execution. "Not just the final moment, but the entire process. I want to understand what it looks like when life leaves the human body." The request itself wasn't particularly shocking. Roman aristocrats regularly attended gladiatorial games and public executions as forms of entertainment. But the clinical detachment in Nero's voice, the way he spoke about human death as if it were an intellectual puzzle to be solved, revealed psychological developments that even Agrippina found disturbing. "Perhaps that level of detail isn't necessary," she suggested carefully. "Emperors traditionally maintain some distance from the actual mechanics of execution." Nero turned to look at her with an expression that made her blood freeze. For just a moment she saw herself reflected in his eyes not as beloved mother and trusted advisor, but as potential obstacle to his absolute freedom. "Mother," he said with perfect courtesy, "I appreciate your guidance, but I think I'm old enough now to decide for myself what kinds of education I require." The exchange marked a turning point in their relationship that Agrippina recognized with growing alarm. The psychological bonds she had spent years creating were still intact, but they were being transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Instead of making Nero dependent on her approval, his obsessive love for her was beginning to manifest as a need to prove himself worthy of her by demonstrating power that surpassed even her own. This dynamic became most apparent in their increasingly complex physical relationship, which had evolved from normal maternal affection into something far more intense and psychologically charged. The transformation had been gradual enough that neither of them had consciously acknowledged what was happening. Embraces that lasted slightly longer than appropriate. Conversations conducted at distances that were intimate rather than familial. Glances that lingered with the kind of intensity typically reserved for lovers rather than family members. But as Nero's imperial power grew, these subtle intimacies began escalating into territory that crossed every boundary of normal family relationships. "You're so beautiful when you're giving orders," he murmured during one of their private meetings, standing close enough that she could feel his breath against her ear. "Watching you control people makes me understand why the gods chose our family to rule over ordinary humans." The comment was simultaneously flattering and deeply inappropriate, delivered with an intensity that made Agrippina's pulse quicken, despite her intellectual understanding that their relationship was entering dangerous territory. But perhaps more troubling than the inappropriate intimacy was her own response to it. She had spent so many years focused on controlling Nero through psychological manipulation that she'd failed to anticipate how his growing power might make him attractive to her in ways that had nothing to do with maternal love. Watching him command senators twice his age, seeing hardened military veterans defer to his authority, witnessing the fear and respect his presence generated throughout the palace, these experiences created a form of sexual tension that Agrippina found increasingly difficult to ignore or control. The situation reached its crisis point during a private dinner they shared after Nero had successfully handled his first major political challenge as emperor. He had ordered the execution of a senator who had been plotting against imperial authority, and the efficient brutality with which he had eliminated the threat had impressed even experienced court observers with its sophisticated cruelty. "I did exactly what you taught me," he said, settling onto the dining couch beside her, with movements that were more predatory than relaxed. "I identified the threat, created a narrative that justified elimination, and removed the obstacle before it could become dangerous. But I also added some innovations of my own." As he described the psychological torture he had inflicted on his victim before ordering the final execution, techniques that went far beyond anything Agrippina had taught him, she found herself responding to his accounts with a mixture of maternal pride and sexual arousal that horrified and fascinated her in equal measure. "You've learned well," she managed to say, her voice carrying a breathiness that she hoped he wouldn't notice. "Perhaps too well." Nero moved closer, close enough that their bodies were almost touching, and looked into her eyes with an expression that contained no trace of filial respect or innocent affection. "I've been thinking about what you said when I was younger, about bonds between family members that are stronger than normal human relationships," he said softly. "I think I finally understand what you meant. What happened next would be remembered as the moment when the last vestiges of normal family dynamics between them were permanently destroyed. Nero kissed her with the same intensity and skill that he was beginning to apply to imperial administration, methodically, thoroughly, and with complete focus on achieving his desired outcome. More significantly, Agrippina found herself responding with enthusiasm that surprised both of them with its genuine passion. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily and staring at each other with expressions that contained equal parts satisfaction and alarm. "This changes everything," Agrippina whispered, her mind already calculating the implications of what had just occurred. "No," Nero replied with the confident authority of someone who had discovered a new source of power. "This makes everything perfect. Now we can truly be what we were always meant to be, not just mother and son, but partners in ways that transcend normal human limitations." Over the following months, their relationship transformed into something that scandalized even the famously decadent Roman court. They appeared together at public functions with an intimacy that made observers uncomfortable, shared private quarters in ways that generated constant speculation and gossip, and developed a form of emotional and physical dependency that seemed to exclude everyone else from their inner circle. But perhaps most significantly, their incestuous bond became the foundation for a new form of imperial power that operated according to principles none of Rome's previous rulers had ever attempted to implement. Together, they began developing techniques for psychological and sexual manipulation that made Caligula's innovations seem crude by comparison. They created networks of compromised supporters who were bound to them through shared participation in increasingly elaborate and forbidden activities. They systematically eliminated anyone who possessed the moral authority or political courage to challenge their behavior. Most importantly, they established the principle that imperial authority transcended all normal human laws and moral constraints, that emperors were literally divine beings whose actions could not be judged by ordinary standards of human behavior. The mother who had created a monster was discovering that she had actually created something far more dangerous, a monster who could create her in return, transforming their relationship into a feedback loop of escalating power and corruption that would eventually consume everything around them. As Agrippina lay in Nero's arms after one of their increasingly frequent intimate encounters, she realized that she had achieved everything she had ever wanted: absolute power, perfect love, and complete control over the most powerful person in the known world. But she was also beginning to understand that some victories were so complete that they became indistinguishable from defeats, and that some bonds were so strong that they became forms of mutual imprisonment from which neither partner could ever escape. The beast had found his perfect mate, and together they would create a new form of imperial horror that would make their individual cruelties seem gentle by comparison. Rome was about to discover what happened when unlimited power was combined with unlimited passion, and placed in the hands of two people who had transcended every normal constraint on human behavior. The age of divine imperial incest was about to begin, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 9. Blood Brothers. The scream that echoed through the palace corridors in the early hours of February 11th, 55 CE wasn't just the sound of a 14-year-old boy dying in agony. It was the death cry of the last innocent soul in the imperial family, and the birth song of an empire where murder had become the primary form of artistic expression. Britannicus clutched his throat as the poison coursed through his young body, his eyes wide with betrayal as he stared across the dining room at his half-brother Nero, who watched the death throes with the fascinated attention of a connoisseur examining a particularly well-executed performance. "Beautiful," Nero murmured to Agrippina, who sat beside him maintaining an expression of shocked concern that would have convinced any observer of her complete innocence. "Look how the pupils dilate just before consciousness fades. It's like watching the exact moment when life transitions into art." Agrippina felt a surge of pride mixed with genuine sexual arousal as she watched her son demonstrate the perfect application of lessons she had spent years teaching him. The elimination of Britannicus was both politically necessary and aesthetically magnificent, a murder so skillfully executed that it appeared to be nothing more than an unfortunate seizure brought on by the excitement of attending his first adult dinner party. But even more intoxicating than the technical perfection of the assassination was the way Nero had incorporated her into the planning and execution, making their shared participation in murder another layer of the intimate bond that was transforming their relationship into something beyond normal human categories. "The timing was perfect," she whispered, her hand finding his under the table as guests around them began responding with appropriate shock and dismay to the apparent medical emergency. Locusta's new formula works even faster than we anticipated. Nero squeezed her fingers with the kind of intensity that sent electric currents through her entire body. The physical contact made even more arousing by the knowledge that they were sharing this intimate moment while surrounded by people who had no idea they were witnessing a carefully orchestrated execution. "I want to do more," he breathed against her ear, his voice carrying the hunger of someone who had discovered a new form of pleasure and craved immediate opportunities to experience it again. "Who else can we eliminate? Which obstacles should we remove next?" The conversation continued in whispered exchanges throughout the chaos that followed Britannicus's death. Physicians rushing to examine the body, slaves removing the corpse with appropriate ceremony, guests expressing condolences and sharing memories of the young prince's brief life. But while everyone else responded to the tragedy with normal human emotions, Agrippina and Nero used the confusion to plan additional murders, their shared excitement about killing making them both increasingly aroused and psychologically bonded through their mutual participation in systematic elimination of threats. Over the following weeks, as Rome mourned the loss of Claudius's younger son and accepted the official explanation that he had died from a hereditary seizure disorder, mother and son began implementing a comprehensive assassination campaign that would clear the path for Nero's absolute authority, while providing them with regular opportunities to experience the intoxicating pleasure of shared murder. The victims were chosen with scientific precision based on their potential threat to imperial authority and their usefulness as subjects for different experimental killing techniques. Each elimination was planned as both political necessity and artistic performance, with careful attention paid to the aesthetic qualities of different death methods and their psychological impact on both victims and observers. Marcus Junius Silanus died from what appeared to be suicide, but which was actually the result of psychological torture so sophisticated that he genuinely believed ending his own life was preferable to continued existence. Agrippina and Nero spent weeks creating circumstances that systematically destroyed his sense of self-worth and hope for the future, then provided him with the means to kill himself while making him believe the idea was entirely his own. "Watch how he holds the blade," Nero observed as they secretly monitored Silanus's final moments. "See how his hands shake with desperation rather than fear. That's the difference between murder and art. We didn't just kill his body, we convinced his soul to eliminate itself." Narcissus, Claudius's former secretary who possessed dangerous knowledge about the circumstances of the emperor's death, succumbed to what appeared to be a wasting disease, but which was actually the result of slow poisoning administered through his daily medications. The process took months, allowing Agrippina and Nero to observe and document the gradual progression of symptoms while refining their techniques for future applications. "The beauty is in the inevitability," Agrippina explained as they watched Narcissus grow progressively weaker and more confused. "He knows something is wrong, but he can't identify the cause or take effective action to protect himself. It's like watching someone drown in air, technically possible to save himself, but practically impossible due to circumstances we control completely." But perhaps the most sophisticated elimination involved Doryphorus, a freedman who had gained too much influence over imperial finances and was beginning to question expenditures that Agrippina preferred to keep confidential. Instead of simply poisoning or assassinating him, they orchestrated an elaborate scenario that resulted in his death during what appeared to be a gladiatorial accident at a private entertainment event. The accident was actually the result of careful planning that involved bribing the gladiator, drugging Doryphorus to slow his reflexes, and modifying the arena to ensure that a seemingly random sword thrust would prove fatal. "The crowd thinks they're witnessing sport," Nero observed with obvious delight as Doryphorus bled out in the sand while spectators cheered. "But we're actually staging theatre where the main character dies for real. It's the ultimate fusion of entertainment and elimination. These shared experiences in systematic murder created psychological and sexual bonds between Agrippina and Nero that grew stronger with each successful assassination. They began spending hours discussing killing techniques with the same passionate intensity that normal lovers might devote to planning romantic encounters. Their physical relationship also intensified in direct proportion to their collaboration in elimination. After each successful murder, they would retreat to Nero's private chambers for sexual encounters that were fueled by the adrenaline of shared violence and the intoxicating sense of absolute power over human life and death. "Killing together makes everything more intense," Agrippina whispered during one of their post-assassination encounters, her body still trembling with excitement from watching their latest victim die according to their carefully planned scenario. "When we decide someone should die, and then make it happen, it's like we're gods creating and destroying reality according to our will." Nero's response was to demonstrate his agreement through physical passion that left both of them exhausted but hungry for additional opportunities to experience the same combination of murder and sexual satisfaction. But the most significant development in their relationship came when they began incorporating elements of their incestuous bond into their public personas as emperor and empress mother, using the scandal and fascination their relationship generated to enhance their psychological control over Roman society. They started appearing together at public events with an intimacy that was obviously inappropriate, but which no one dared challenge directly. Their behaviour during official ceremonies, state dinners, and religious festivals became the subject of constant speculation and gossip throughout the empire, but the very outrageousness of their conduct made it impossible for critics to address openly without risking charges of treason or blasphemy. "Let them whisper," Nero declared during one of their planning sessions. "Let them speculate about what we do in private. Their fascination with our relationship makes them psychologically dependent on us, even when they disapprove of our behaviour. We've become the central drama of their lives, whether they love us or hate us." The strategy was devastatingly effective. Roman citizens found themselves obsessively discussing every aspect of the imperial family's behaviour, analysing every gesture and glance for evidence of the forbidden relationship everyone suspected but no one could prove. This obsession created a form of psychological addiction that made the population emotionally invested in the continuation of the very scandal that officially disgusted them. More importantly, the constant focus on their personal relationship distracted attention from their systematic elimination of political rivals and potential threats to imperial authority. While everyone debated whether the emperor was sleeping with his mother, few people noticed that dozens of influential Romans were dying under mysterious circumstances that all seemed to benefit the imperial family's consolidation of power. By the end of 55 CE, Agrippina and Nero had successfully eliminated every significant threat to his reign, while establishing a public persona that made them the most fascinating and controversial figures in the Roman Empire. Their combination of political murder and sexual scandal had created a new form of imperial authority that operated according to principles no previous ruler had ever attempted to implement. But perhaps most significantly, their shared participation in systematic killing had created psychological bonds between them that transcended normal human relationships and approached the level of religious devotion. They had become each other's perfect complement, the mother who had taught her son to kill with artistic precision, and the son who had learned to transform murder into the ultimate expression of love for the woman who had created him. Together they represented something entirely new in human history, a form of power that combined absolute political authority with absolute personal intimacy, creating an empire where the most forbidden human desires could be expressed through the systematic elimination of anyone who dared to oppose them. The Blood Brothers had found their perfect partnership, and Rome was about to discover what happened when unlimited power was exercised by two people who had transcended every normal constraint on human behaviour while remaining bound to each other through chains of shared violence and mutual obsession. The age of divine imperial murder was reaching its full flowering, and the world would never recover from what they were about to create together. Chapter 10. The Unnatural Union. The silk curtains that surrounded Nero's bed billowed gently in the evening breeze, creating an intimate sanctuary where the most powerful man in the world could finally drop every pretense and reveal his true nature to the one person who understood him completely. But as Agrippina moved through the candle-lit chamber, her silk stola rustling softly against the marble floor, She was no longer simply a mother visiting her son's private quarters. She was his lover, his co-conspirator, his partner in creating a new form of divine authority that would reshape human civilization through the systematic application of forbidden desire and unlimited violence. The Senate met again today to discuss our relationship, Nero observed from his position on the ivory and gold couch, his naked body displayed with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned to feel shame about his appetites. Senator Thrasea actually had the audacity to suggest that certain imperial behaviours might be setting inappropriate examples for Roman youth. Agrippina smiled as she settled beside him, her movements graceful enough to make watching her a form of aesthetic pleasure that transcended normal sexual attraction and approached religious reverence. "And what was your response to this concerned senator?" she asked, her fingers tracing patterns on Nero's chest with the kind of intimate familiarity that made their relationship impossible to mistake for normal family affection. "I invited him to attend a private dinner party where he can observe imperial behaviour more closely," Nero replied with obvious satisfaction. "Locusta is preparing a special menu that should resolve his concerns about inappropriate examples permanently." The exchange epitomized everything their relationship had become. Casual discussion of murder mixed with physical intimacy that violated every taboo of normal human society, all conducted with the serene confidence of people who had transcended ordinary moral constraints through the simple expedient of possessing unlimited power. Over the past year, their incestuous bond had evolved from forbidden attraction into something approaching religious union between divine beings who existed beyond the judgment of ordinary humans. They no longer bothered hiding their relationship from court observers, instead treating their physical and emotional intimacy as natural expressions of imperial authority that required no justification or explanation. "The people need to understand," Agrippina murmured as she moved to straddle Nero's body with movements that combined maternal tenderness with sophisticated sexual technique, "that we represent something entirely new in human history. We're not bound by the same limitations that constrain ordinary relationships because we're not ordinary people." The philosophical framework they had developed to justify their behaviour was actually more sophisticated than most observers realised, drawing on Egyptian precedents where pharaohs married their sisters to preserve divine bloodlines, and incorporating elements of Greek mythology where gods regularly engaged in incestuous relationships that produced heroic offspring. They had created a theological argument that presented their union as necessary for maintaining the spiritual purity required for effective imperial rule. But beneath these intellectual justifications lay psychological dynamics that were far more complex and disturbing than simple sexual transgression. Their relationship had become a feedback loop of mutual obsession, where each partner's devotion to the other was intensified by their shared participation in systematic violence against everyone who threatened their bond. Every murder they planned together strengthened their emotional connection. Every elimination they executed as a team created new layers of intimate dependency that made separation literally unthinkable for either of them. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the Christians," Nero mentioned as their physical encounter intensified, his voice maintaining conversational tone despite the increasingly passionate nature of their activities. "Perhaps it's time to demonstrate what happens to people who promote moral systems that challenge imperial authority." The ability to discuss mass murder while engaged in forbidden sexual acts represented the ultimate expression of the psychological transformation they had undergone together. Normal human categories of behaviour, family relationships, political responsibility, moral constraints, had been completely replaced by a single organising principle: the mutual satisfaction of desires that transcended every boundary of civilized conduct. Their physical relationship itself had evolved into something that combined elements of maternal nurturing, sexual passion, religious devotion, and collaborative sadism in ways that created entirely new forms of human experience. Agrippina would spend hours worshipping Nero's body with techniques that drew on both maternal love and sophisticated sexual expertise, treating him simultaneously as beloved child and divine lover while discussing the technical details of their latest assassination plans. Nero would respond with physical passion that incorporated elements of filial devotion and dominant sexuality, expressing his love for her through combinations of tender reverence and aggressive possession, that created psychological bonds stronger than any normal relationship could produce. But perhaps most significantly, they had begun incorporating their victims into their sexual activities in ways that made murder itself a form of erotic entertainment. "Bring in the traitor," Nero commanded during one of their evening encounters, summoning guards who dragged a condemned senator into the imperial bedchamber, where he would be forced to witness the incestuous union before being executed as the climax of their shared sexual experience. These performances served multiple purposes simultaneously, demonstrating their complete contempt for normal moral boundaries, terrorizing potential enemies through psychological warfare that exceeded anything previous rulers had attempted, and creating shared memories of forbidden pleasure that intensified their mutual obsession with each other. The condemned victims, who were forced to witness their activities before dying, became unwilling participants in a form of sexual theatre that transformed execution from simple elimination into artistic expression of divine authority over both life and moral law. "Watch how they try not to look," Agrippina would whisper to Nero, as they maintained eye contact with their terrified audience. "But can't help being fascinated by what we're doing. Even people who are about to die are drawn to observe forbidden relationships between gods." The psychological impact on their victims was devastating. Being forced to witness imperial incest before execution created a form of mental torture that exceeded physical pain in its capacity to destroy human dignity and psychological coherence. Many victims begged for immediate death rather than continued exposure to activities that challenged their fundamental understanding of human nature and divine authority. But for Agrippina and Nero, these reactions only confirmed their belief that they had transcended normal human limitations and achieved a form of existence that was simultaneously terrifying and fascinating to ordinary mortals. Their relationship also began influencing imperial policy in ways that systematically dismantled traditional Roman moral structures, while replacing them with new forms of social organization based on the celebration of forbidden desires and the elimination of anyone who refused to participate. Laws were passed that relaxed traditional restrictions on sexual behavior between family members, ostensibly to allow Egyptian and Eastern customs to be practiced freely within the empire, but actually to create legal frameworks that normalized the kind of relationship Agrippina and Nero were modeling at the highest levels of government. Religious ceremonies were modified to incorporate elements that celebrated the divine nature of imperial family bonds, with priests required to offer prayers praising the sacred love between the emperor and his mother as an example of perfect spiritual union that transcended ordinary human understanding. Most significantly, court positions were increasingly awarded to individuals who demonstrated enthusiastic support for the new imperial moral order, while traditional Roman aristocrats who expressed discomfort with recent developments found themselves facing charges of treason or religious blasphemy that typically resulted in execution or exile. "We're not just ruling an empire," Agrippina explained during one of their philosophical discussions, her naked body intertwined with Nero's in positions that would have been considered impossible for normal family relationships. "We're creating a new form of human civilization where the greatest taboos become the highest expressions of divine authority." The transformation they were implementing extended beyond Rome itself to influence the entire known world. Provincial governors were required to demonstrate their loyalty to imperial authority by participating in ceremonies that celebrated the sacred union between emperor and empress mother. Foreign ambassadors were expected to witness displays of imperial intimacy as part of their official duties. Even military campaigns were conducted with the understanding that soldiers were fighting to protect a form of divine rule that operated according to principles that transcended normal human morality. By 58 CE, the Roman Empire had become something unprecedented in human history, a civilization organized around the principle that unlimited power should be exercised by individuals who had transcended every normal constraint on human behavior through their willingness to embrace the most forbidden forms of love and violence. But as Agrippina and Nero achieved perfect unity in their shared transgression of every human taboo, they also began to recognize that their relationship had created psychological dynamics that neither of them could fully control or predict. Their mutual obsession had become so intense that separation for even brief periods caused both partners to experience anxiety that approached panic. Their shared participation in systematic murder had created dependencies that required regular violence to maintain psychological equilibrium. Most significantly, Their incestuous bond had established patterns of dominance and submission that were constantly shifting in ways that threatened to destabilize their perfect partnership. "Sometimes I wonder," Nero admitted during a moment of unusual vulnerability, "whether we've created something so perfect that it can't survive in the same world as ordinary human beings." Agrippina's response was to demonstrate through renewed physical passion that their union was strong enough to overcome any challenge. But privately, she was beginning to recognize that they had indeed created something that might be too intense and pure for long-term survival in a world that still contained people capable of opposing them. The unnatural union had achieved everything they had dreamed of, and more. But it had also created psychological and political dynamics that would inevitably lead to conflicts that could only be resolved through the complete destruction of one partner by the other. The perfect love was approaching its perfect crisis, and Rome would soon discover what happened when gods decided to wage war against each other, using every weapon that unlimited power and unlimited passion could provide. Chapter 11. The Student Becomes the Master. The Great Fire began at midnight on July 18th, 64th CE, but Nero had been planning to burn Rome for over 2 years. Standing on the balcony of his palace as flames devoured the Circus Maximus below, the 26-year-old emperor felt the intoxicating satisfaction of someone who had finally achieved the perfect synthesis of artistic vision and absolute power. Beside him, Agrippina watched her son's face glow with reflected firelight and realized with growing horror that she had created something beyond even her capacity to understand or control. "It's magnificent," Nero breathed, his voice carrying the reverence of someone witnessing divine creation. "Look how the flames dance against the night sky. Listen to the symphony of destruction echoing across the 7 hills. This is what gods must feel when they reshape reality according to their desires." The fire had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of Nero's major projects. Teams of trained incendiaries had been positioned throughout the city for months, disguised as merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens while they prepared materials and identified optimal targets for maximum destruction. But the true genius of the operation lay not in its technical execution, but in its artistic conception as the largest human sacrifice in history, combined with the most ambitious urban planning project ever attempted. "You're going to kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people," Agrippina said, her voice carrying a note of alarm that she had never felt during their previous collaborative murders. "This isn't elimination of specific threats. This is genocide as entertainment." Nero turned to look at her with an expression that made her blood freeze. For the first time in their relationship, she saw herself reflected in his eyes, not as beloved mother and trusted partner, but as someone whose understanding had become inadequate for appreciating the full scope of his vision. "Mother," he said with patient condescension, "you taught me that human lives exist to serve our purposes. Tonight I'm simply applying that lesson on the scale that Imperial authority makes possible. Instead of killing individuals to remove obstacles, I'm killing populations to create opportunities." The fire raged for 6 days and 7 nights, consuming 10 of Rome's 14 districts and leaving hundreds of thousands of citizens homeless, injured or dead. But even as the city burned around them, Nero and his architects were already implementing plans for reconstruction that would transform Rome into the most magnificent urban centre in human history. The new Rome would feature wider streets designed for better traffic flow and fire prevention. Public buildings would be constructed with improved materials and safety features. Most importantly, vast areas would be cleared for the construction of Nero's Domus Aurea, a palace complex that would cover nearly a third of the entire city and serve as the ultimate expression of divine imperial authority. "Do you see?" Nero asked as he showed Agrippina the architectural plans that had been prepared years in advance of the fire. "Every death serves a greater purpose. Every destroyed building makes space for something more beautiful. I'm not just murdering people, I'm sculpting civilization itself." But the Great Fire also marked the beginning of Nero's systematic independence from his mother's influence and guidance. Having demonstrated that his capacity for violence exceeded even her imagination, he no longer felt psychologically dependent on her approval or strategically reliant on her expertise. The change became apparent in how he handled the political aftermath of the destruction. Where Agrippina would have focused on eliminating specific threats while maintaining plausible deniability, Nero chose to embrace responsibility for the fire while transforming public outrage into an opportunity for even more spectacular displays of imperial power. When rumours began circulating that he had deliberately burned the city, instead of denying involvement, he redirected public anger toward the Christian population by claiming they had started the fire as part of their war against traditional Roman religion. The persecution that followed was unprecedented in its systematic brutality and theatrical sophistication. Christians were crucified by the hundreds along major roads leading into Rome. Others were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild beasts in the arena. Most memorably, many were covered in pitch and used as human torches to illuminate Nero's garden parties, creating a form of entertainment that combined religious persecution with artistic lighting design. "Watch how the flames consume their bodies," Nero observed during one of these gatherings, his arm around Agrippina as they watched dozens of Christians burn alive while guests dined on elaborate delicacies. "It's like watching prayers being transformed into light. Their God promised them eternal life, and I'm providing it through fire." Agrippina found herself simultaneously aroused and terrified by her son's capacity for innovative cruelty. The techniques he was developing exceeded anything she had taught him, incorporating elements of psychological torture, religious blasphemy, and aesthetic sophistication that created entirely new categories of human suffering. But perhaps more disturbing was how he began applying these techniques to people within their own circle, demonstrating that no relationship was sacred enough to protect someone from elimination if they ceased to serve his purposes effectively. Seneca, who had been Nero's tutor and advisor since childhood, was forced to commit suicide after being accused of participating in a conspiracy that existed primarily in the emperor's imagination. The execution was designed to appear voluntary, but Seneca was actually given a choice between public torture, followed by execution or private suicide, that would preserve his family's honour and property. "He taught me to think," Nero explained to Agrippina as they watched Seneca's death throes from a hidden observation chamber. But he never learned to stop thinking when thought became inconvenient. Teachers become obstacles when students surpass their capacity for instruction. The comment contained implications that made Agrippina's heart race with anxiety. If Nero was willing to eliminate the man who had shaped his intellectual development, what would prevent him from eventually deciding that his mother had also outlived her usefulness as advisor and collaborator? Her fears intensified when she began noticing subtle changes in how Nero treated her during their private interactions. The passionate devotion that had characterized their relationship for years remained intact, but it was increasingly combined with moments of assessment and evaluation that suggested he was analyzing her utility with the same cold calculation he applied to potential political threats. "You seem tired lately," he mentioned during one of their evening encounters, his hands exploring her body with familiar expertise while his voice carried undertones of clinical observation. "Perhaps the stress of imperial administration is becoming too demanding for someone of your maturity." The suggestion that she might be losing her effectiveness due to age was terrifying, not just because it questioned her capabilities, but because it introduced the possibility that Nero might eventually view her as a liability rather than an asset to his imperial ambitions. More ominously, she began detecting signs that he was building relationships with advisors and supporters who owed their positions entirely to him rather than to their shared collaboration. These new associates possessed skills and knowledge that complemented rather than duplicated her own expertise, suggesting that Nero was systematically reducing his dependence on her guidance while expanding his capacity for independent action. "I've been thinking about expansion," he announced during one of their planning sessions, presenting maps and strategic analyses that had obviously been prepared without her input. "Not just military conquest, but cultural transformation. I want to create an empire where Roman values are replaced with principles that reflect our understanding of divine authority." The plans he outlined were breathtaking in scope and sophistication, involving systematic modification of religious practices, educational systems, and social structures throughout the known world. But they also represented a level of strategic thinking that exceeded anything they had developed together, suggesting that his intellectual development had reached a point where her contributions were no longer essential for his continued success. As 64 CE drew to a close with Rome still smouldering and reconstruction beginning according to Nero's grand vision, Agrippina realized that she faced the most dangerous crisis of her life. The son she had created and shaped into the perfect instrument of her ambitions had indeed become perfect, so perfect that he no longer needed her guidance to achieve goals that exceeded even her imagination. Their incestuous bond remained intact, but it was being transformed from partnership into a relationship where she existed primarily to serve his pleasure rather than to shape his development. The student had become the master, and the master was beginning to consider whether his former teacher had become an obstacle to his continued evolution toward absolute divine authority. For the first time since childhood, Agrippina found herself in a position where her survival depended not on her ability to manipulate others, but on her capacity to remain useful to someone whose power exceeded her own, and whose psychological development had moved beyond her ability to predict or control. The woman who had spent decades eliminating threats was about to discover what it felt like to become a threat that someone else might decide to eliminate. The perfect creation was preparing to destroy its creator, and Rome was about to witness the ultimate expression of the imperial power, a son's murder of the mother who had taught him everything he knew about killing. Chapter 12. The Mother's Fear. The knock on Agrippina's chamber door came at the hour when shadows were deepest, and servants walked on tiptoe through corridors that seemed to whisper of impending doom. But as she rose from her solitary bed, for Nero had not visited her private quarters in over a month, Agrippina knew that whoever waited outside brought news that would confirm her worst fears about her son's intentions. "Domina," whispered Agerinus, her most trusted freedman, his face pale with terror that made his usual composure appear laughably inadequate for current circumstances. "I've discovered something that threatens your life in ways that demand immediate action." Agrippina gestured him inside with hands that remained steady, despite the dread that had been growing in her heart since the Great Fire. At 44, she retained the ethereal beauty that had made her the most desired woman in Rome, but recent months had added lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent calculating survival strategies against an enemy she had created but could no longer control. "Tell me everything," she commanded, settling into her chair with the regal bearing that had never abandoned her even in moments of greatest personal crisis. What Agerinus revealed would have shocked even someone accustomed to the casual brutality of imperial politics. Nero had begun meeting secretly with Anicetus, the admiral of the fleet at Misenum, to discuss methods for eliminating his mother that would appear accidental while providing him with perfect alibis for her death. "They've been planning for weeks," Agerinus reported, his voice barely audible as he described conversations he had overheard while serving wine during what had appeared to be routine military briefings. "The Emperor wants her death to look like misfortune rather than murder, but he also wants it to be spectacular enough to demonstrate his power over everyone who might consider opposing him." The specific method under consideration was both ingenious and horrifying in its calculated cruelty. Nero intended to invite Agrippina to join him for a festival celebration at his villa in Baiae, then arrange for her to return to Rome aboard a specially modified ship designed to collapse or sink during the voyage, making her death appear to be a tragic accident that befell a devoted mother returning from a family reconciliation. But the true horror lay not in the technical details of the assassination plan, but in the psychological framework Nero had developed to justify matricide to himself and his collaborators. "He speaks of her as if she's already dead," Agerinus whispered, his words carrying the chill of someone who had witnessed the complete moral transformation of a person he had once respected. "He refers to the obstacle that will soon be removed, and discusses how much more effectively he'll be able to govern once he's freed from sentimental limitations that constrain divine authority." Agrippina absorbed this intelligence with the focused concentration of a military strategist, analysing enemy positions, but inside her heart was breaking in ways she had never experienced before. The son she had loved with intensity that transcended normal human relationships, the child she had shaped into the perfect expression of her own ambitions, had decided that she was no longer useful enough to justify continued existence. More devastating than the threat to her life was the realization that Nero's psychological development had reached a point where he could contemplate her murder without experiencing the kind of emotional conflict that might create exploitable weaknesses in his resolve. "Has he discussed timing?" she asked, her voice maintaining the steady control that had served her throughout decades of imperial intrigue. "The festival of Quinquatrus begins in 10 days. He plans to send the invitation tomorrow, and he expects the elimination to occur during her return voyage." Agerinus paused, then added the detail that revealed the full extent of Nero's psychological transformation. He's already commissioned poets to write elegies mourning his tragic loss and praising his courage in continuing to serve Rome despite overwhelming personal grief. The conversation continued for another hour as Agrippina extracted every available detail about Nero's plans, but even as she gathered intelligence necessary for her survival, she was also coming to terms with the emotional reality of her situation. The perfect love she had created through years of psychological manipulation and sexual transgression had finally achieved the independence she had always known it would eventually develop. But instead of growing into a relationship between equals who could rule together as divine partners, it had evolved into something where her continued existence represented an impediment to his absolute authority. Nero no longer needed her guidance to achieve his goals. He no longer required her approval to validate his decisions. Most significantly, he no longer felt the psychological dependency that had once made betraying her literally unthinkable. The incestuous bond that had been designed to ensure eternal loyalty had instead created a form of love so intense that it could only be resolved through the complete consumption of one partner by the other. Over the following days, as Agrippina waited for the invitation she knew would arrive and began preparing countermeasures for the assassination attempt she couldn't prevent, she found herself experiencing emotions she had never allowed herself to feel during her decades of political manipulation and systematic murder. Genuine grief over the loss of a relationship that had been the central meaning of her existence. Profound regret about the methods she had used to create psychological bonds that were now being turned against her. Most painfully, a form of maternal love that transcended strategic calculation and made her genuinely proud of the monster she had created even as it prepared to destroy her. "I taught him too well," she murmured during one of her solitary evenings, gazing out at the lights of Rome and remembering the small boy who had once depended on her for everything from physical comfort to moral guidance. "He learned every lesson I gave him and then developed innovations that exceeded my imagination." The invitation arrived exactly as predicted, elegantly written, affectionately phrased, and containing subtle implications that made refusal impossible without creating open conflict that would only accelerate the timeline for her elimination. "Dearest mother," it began in Nero's familiar script, "I find myself longing for your company during the upcoming festival celebrations. Perhaps we could spend time together at my villa in Bedside, where we can enjoy the sea air and remember why our family bond remains the most precious aspect of my existence." Reading these words, Agrippina felt simultaneously touched by their apparent sincerity and terrified by their obvious deception. Nero possessed the same talent for combining genuine emotion with calculated manipulation that had made her so effective at controlling others, and he was now applying those skills to their relationship with techniques that matched her own sophistication. But she also recognized that she had no choice except to accept the invitation and walk knowingly into the trap he had prepared. Refusing would only convince him that she suspected his intentions, which would lead him to abandon subtle assassination methods in favor of direct violence that would be impossible to survive or escape. Her only hope lay in turning his own trap against him by surviving the assassination attempt and using the evidence of his matricidal intentions to destroy his credibility with the Senate, the military, and the Roman people. As she began preparing for what she knew would be her final confrontation with the son who had become her greatest enemy, Agrippina found herself remembering the first time she had held him as an infant and felt the overwhelming love that had shaped every decision she had made for the past 27 years. That love remained intact despite everything that had happened between them. Even knowing that he intended to murder her, she still felt pride in his accomplishments and admiration for the skills he had developed under her tutelage. But she also understood that love alone would not save her from someone who had learned to transform every human emotion into a weapon that served his purposes. The mother's fear was not just about dying, it was about the realization that she had succeeded too completely in her greatest project, creating a perfect predator who no longer needed her guidance to hunt the most dangerous prey of all. The student had indeed become the master, and now the master was preparing to demonstrate his superiority by eliminating the teacher who had made his education possible. Agrippina began her preparations for the journey to Baiae knowing that she was walking toward her own death, but determined to ensure that even her murder would serve as one final lesson in the art of imperial survival. If Nero wanted to kill his mother, he would discover that the woman who had taught him everything about assassination had saved a few techniques for their final encounter. The greatest game of their lives was about to begin, and only one player would survive to claim victory. Chapter 13. The Ship of Death. The vessel that Anicetus had prepared for Agrippina's final voyage was a masterpiece of mechanical murder disguised as imperial luxury. From the outside, the ship appeared magnificent, gleaming white sails adorned with gold thread, polished bronze fittings that caught the morning sunlight like jewellery, and appointments worthy of transporting the emperor's beloved mother in comfort befitting her exalted status. But beneath the beautiful exterior lay engineering modifications that would transform the peaceful journey from Baiae to Bauli into the most elaborate assassination attempt in Roman history. Standing on the dock as servants loaded her personal belongings aboard the death ship, Agrippina felt the cold satisfaction of someone who had recognized her enemy's strategy and prepared appropriate countermeasures. The accommodations are truly magnificent, she observed to Anicetus, who supervised the boarding preparations with the nervous efficiency of someone managing a project where failure would mean his own death. My son has clearly spared no expense to ensure my comfort during this voyage. Anicetus managed a smile that didn't quite conceal the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool sea breeze. Caesar commanded that every detail reflect his love and respect for his honoured mother. I trust you'll find the journey memorable. The double meaning wasn't lost on Agrippina, but she maintained the gracious demeanour appropriate for an empress mother accepting her son's generous hospitality. Let Anicetus believe that his elaborate trap had caught an unsuspecting victim. The reality would become apparent soon enough. As the ship departed Baiae harbour, with Agrippina reclining comfortably in the luxuriously appointed cabin, neither she nor her would-be assassins suspected that they were actually participants in a much larger game where the intended victim had become the primary strategist. The mechanical modifications Nero and Anicetus had made to the vessel were indeed ingenious. The cabin ceiling was designed to collapse on command through a system of ropes and counterweights that could be activated from the deck above. The hull contained hidden chambers that could be flooded to cause rapid sinking. Even the furniture had been modified to become potential weapons, chairs and couches that could be triggered to release blades or collapse into configurations that would trap and injure occupants. But Agrippina had spent weeks preparing for this assassination attempt through her own network of loyal agents and technical experts. Every modification to the ship had been secretly documented, every mechanical trap had been identified and studied, and comprehensive countermeasures had been developed to neutralize each method of murder, while creating evidence of the assassination attempt that could be used to destroy Nero politically. The plan she had developed was characteristically sophisticated, involving not just survival of the immediate threat, but transformation of the entire situation into a weapon that could be used against her son with devastating effectiveness. As the ship moved through the calm waters between Baiae and Bauli, Agrippina positioned herself strategically within the cabin while her personal servants, who were actually trained soldiers loyal to her rather than ordinary household staff, prepared to implement defensive measures that had been rehearsed dozens of times during the preceding weeks. The first assassination attempt came exactly as she had anticipated. A subtle creaking sound from the cabin ceiling indicated that someone on deck was beginning to manipulate the rope system designed to trigger the collapse of the heavy wooden beams above her head. But instead of remaining in the area where the falling ceiling would cause maximum damage, Agrippina moved to a protected corner while her disguised soldiers created the illusion that she'd been caught by surprise and injured in the collapse. The crash was tremendous, sending splinters of wood flying throughout the cabin and creating noise that could be heard across the water by observers on nearby vessels. Exactly the kind of witnesses Agrippina needed to document the accident that had befallen the emperor's mother. As dust and debris settled around the wreckage of the cabin ceiling, carefully planted evidence began revealing the true nature of what had occurred. Ropes that should have been ship's rigging were exposed as mechanical triggers. Counterweights designed to ensure lethal impact were visible among the fallen beams. Most damning of all, tools and materials that could only have been used for deliberate sabotage were discovered by Agrippina's servants in locations that suggested hasty concealment by guilty parties. "Help!" screamed one of her disguised soldiers, his voice carrying across the water to fishing boats and pleasure craft that had gathered to witness what appeared to be a tragic accident involving the Imperial family. The Empress Mother has been injured. The ship is damaged. We need assistance immediately. The performance was perfectly calculated to create maximum publicity for the accident, while generating sympathy for Agrippina and suspicion about the circumstances that had led to such a convenient mishap during her return from visiting her beloved son. But the true genius of her counter-strategy became apparent when the ship's hull began taking on water through the flooding mechanisms that an ascetus had installed as backup methods for ensuring her death if the ceiling collapse proved insufficient. Instead of allowing the ship to sink with her trapped inside, Agrippina had prepared escape routes that would allow her to survive the sinking, while making it appear that she had barely escaped death through extraordinary luck and determination. As water poured into the ship's lower compartments and the vessel began listing dangerously, she and her loyal companions abandoned ship in a carefully choreographed sequence that maximized dramatic impact while ensuring their safe rescue by the boats that were already racing toward them. "Swim toward the fishing vessel," she commanded her people as they entered the water, her voice carrying clearly to everyone within hearing distance. "If we survive this, we must reach Rome immediately to warn the emperor that someone is trying to murder his family." The statement was masterfully constructed to plant suspicions about assassination attempts, while maintaining the fiction that Nero himself couldn't possibly be responsible for endangering his beloved mother. Within hours, news of the accident had reached Rome, along with eyewitness accounts describing the miraculous survival of the Empress Mother and disturbing evidence suggesting that her ship had been deliberately sabotaged by unknown enemies of the imperial family. The political impact was exactly what Agrippina had calculated. Senators who had been growing uncomfortable with Nero's excesses rallied to support the Emperor's mother, viewing her as a stabilizing influence who might moderate his more destructive impulses. Military commanders who had witnessed her courage during the assassination attempt began questioning the loyalty of anyone who would target such a revered member of the imperial family. Most significantly, the Roman people, who had always possessed complicated feelings about Agrippina, now saw her as a tragic figure who had nearly died while returning from a loving visit with her son. But Nero's response to news of his mother's survival revealed the full extent of his psychological transformation and political miscalculation. Instead of expressing relief and gratitude that she had escaped the accident, he reacted with obvious disappointment and anger that suggested personal involvement in the assassination attempt. Worse still, his immediate response was to begin planning more direct methods for eliminating her, abandoning all pretense of maintaining plausible deniability. "If subtle methods won't work," he declared to Anicetus during a meeting that Agrippina's spies documented in detail, "then we'll resort to techniques that guarantee success regardless of public opinion. I'm tired of allowing sentimental considerations to interfere with necessary political actions." The statement provided Agrippina with exactly the kind of evidence she needed to destroy Nero's credibility, while positioning herself as the victim of an ungrateful son who had forgotten his obligations to the woman who had made his reign possible. Over the following days, as Rome buzzed with rumours and speculation about the mysterious ship accident, Agrippina began implementing the final phase of her counter-strategy, a comprehensive political campaign designed to turn Nero's assassination attempt into the catalyst for his eventual downfall. She arranged for key senators to receive detailed intelligence about the ship's mechanical modifications, along with documentation proving that the sabotage had been ordered and financed through imperial resources. She provided military commanders with evidence of Nero's involvement in the assassination plot, including recorded conversations and written orders that revealed his matricidal intentions. Most devastatingly, she began sharing information about Nero's other crimes, the murders of Britannicus, Claudius, and dozens of other victims, with individuals who possessed the authority and motivation to act on such intelligence. The ship of death had indeed served its purpose, but not in the way that Nero and Anicetus had planned. Instead of eliminating the greatest threat to imperial authority, it had provided that threat with weapons that could be used to destroy the emperor himself. Agrippina had survived the most sophisticated assassination attempt in Roman history, and transformed it into evidence that would eventually bring down the son who had ordered her murder. But she also understood that Nero's response to this failure would be swift, direct, and impossible to survive through clever counter-strategies. Having failed to kill her subtly, he would now resort to methods that prioritized success over political considerations. The final confrontation between mother and son was about to begin, and this time, only one of them would survive to see the dawn. The ship of death had delivered its passenger safely to shore, but the voyage it began would end only when the most dangerous family in Roman history had finally destroyed itself through the logical conclusion of the violence and manipulation that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Chapter 14. The Final Gambit. The message arrived at dawn, delivered by a slave whose hands shook so violently that the wax tablet nearly fell from his trembling fingers before Agrippina could accept it. But as she read the brief, brutal text, her own hands remained perfectly steady, despite the fact that she was holding her own death warrant written in her son's familiar script. Mother, come to me immediately. We have urgent matters to discuss that cannot wait for formal arrangements. Your loving son, Nero. 27 words that meant, the subtle approach has failed. Now comes direct action that will end this conflict permanently. Agrippina set the tablet aside and moved to her window, gazing out at Rome awakening to what she knew would be the final day of their relationship. Somewhere in the sprawling city below, Nero was making last-minute preparations for an assassination that would abandon all pretense of accident or plausible deniability. This time, there would be no elaborate mechanical traps or carefully staged mishaps. This time, he intended to have her killed by loyal soldiers who would follow Imperial commands without question, creating a situation where her death would be attributed to natural causes or unfortunate illness that befell an aging woman who had endured too much stress and trauma. But Agrippina had not survived 5 decades of imperial politics by walking blindly into obvious death traps, even when they were set by someone she had loved with intensity that transcended normal human relationships. Over the past weeks, since her miraculous survival of the ship assassination, she had been implementing the most comprehensive contingency plan of her life, a strategy designed not just to ensure her own survival, but to guarantee that her death, if it came, would trigger consequences that would destroy Nero's reign and legacy. The plan involved 3 interconnected elements that would activate automatically upon her elimination, creating a cascade of political and social destruction that would make her murder the catalyst for imperial collapse. First, detailed documentation of Nero's crimes, including his involvement in the deaths of Claudius, Britannicus, and dozens of other victims, had been secretly distributed to trusted agents throughout the empire, with instructions to release the information publicly if anything happened to her. These documents included not just allegations but physical evidence, poison recipes in Nero's handwriting, financial records showing payments for assassinations, and sworn testimony from witnesses who could verify the emperor's personal involvement in systematic murder. Second, she had arranged for key military commanders and provincial governors to receive sealed orders that would be opened only upon news of her death. These orders, written in her name but carrying the authority of individuals who owed their positions to her influence, would command immediate action to avenge the murder of the empress mother and restore legitimate imperial authority through coordinated military action against Nero's supporters. Most importantly, she had established communication with Gaius Calpurnius Piso and other senators who had been quietly organizing opposition to Nero's excesses. Her death would serve as the signal for a comprehensive conspiracy that was already prepared to move against the emperor with a kind of coordinated efficiency that could topple even divine imperial authority. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of her final strategy involved the letter she had prepared for Nero himself, a document that would be delivered to him immediately after her death, and which contained revelations that would destroy his sanity, even if his reign somehow survived the political consequences of matricide. "My beloved son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have finally achieved the independence from my influence that you have desired for so long. But before you celebrate your freedom, there are certain truths about our relationship that you should understand." What followed was a detailed confession of every manipulation she had used to shape his psychological development, every technique she had employed to create his obsessive dependency on her approval, and every method she had applied to transform normal filial love into the incestuous passion that had defined their relationship. More devastatingly, the letter revealed the calculated nature of emotions he had believed were genuine expressions of maternal love. His entire understanding of their relationship, the foundation of his identity as both emperor and human being, would be revealed as an elaborate psychological construction designed to serve her political purposes. "You believe that our love transcends normal human limitations," the letter continued, "but you should know that every aspect of our intimacy was planned and orchestrated to ensure your loyalty to my agenda. Your passionate devotion to me was not divine destiny, but manufactured dependency created through systematic manipulation of your emotional development." The psychological impact of these revelations would be devastating for someone whose entire sense of self-worth depended on the belief that he was genuinely loved by the one person whose opinion mattered to him. Learning that their relationship had been founded on calculated deception rather than authentic emotion would likely trigger the kind of mental breakdown that would make effective imperial administration impossible. But as Agrippina completed her preparations for what she expected would be her final meeting with Nero, she found herself experiencing genuine grief about the necessity of destroying the son she had created and, despite everything, continued to love. The monster she had shaped through years of manipulation and psychological conditioning was indeed a monster, but he was also her greatest achievement, a human being who had transcended every normal limitation on power and ambition through the application of techniques she had taught him. Even knowing that he intended to murder her, she felt proud of his accomplishments and impressed by the sophistication of his elimination methods. He had learned his lessons well, perhaps too well for either of them to survive the logical conclusion of their relationship. As she prepared to leave her villa for the palace meeting that would determine whether she lived or died, Agrippina took one final look around the chambers that had served as her sanctuary during the most dangerous years of her life. Here she had planned the murder of Claudius, orchestrated the elimination of Britannicus, and developed the psychological techniques that had made her son into the perfect instrument of her ambitions. Here she had also experienced the most intense love of her life and created bonds of intimacy that had transcended every normal category of human relationship. Whatever happened in the coming hours, she had lived a life that exceeded the dreams of ordinary mortals. She had possessed power that rivaled the gods, experienced passion that surpassed normal human limitations, and created something unprecedented in human history through her transformation of maternal love into the ultimate weapon of political control. If Nero succeeded in killing her, she would die knowing that she had taught him well enough to ensure his own eventual destruction through the consequences of matricide. If she somehow survived their final confrontation, she would continue the campaign that would ultimately bring down the emperor who had dared to threaten the woman who made his reign possible. Either way, the game that had begun with her birth into the Julio-Claudian dynasty was approaching its inevitable conclusion. The blood princess who had become an empress mother was ready for her final performance on the stage of imperial politics. As her litter carried her through the streets of Rome toward the palace, where Nero waited with his carefully prepared assassination plan, Agrippina smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had played every move perfectly in a game where victory was guaranteed regardless of which player survived to claim it. The final gambit was about to begin, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of the Roman Empire itself. The most dangerous woman in history was approaching her greatest challenge, armed with weapons that would prove effective whether she lived or died to use them. Nero was about to discover that some victories were so costly that they became indistinguishable from defeats, and that some enemies were most dangerous in the moment of their apparent destruction. The ultimate lesson in imperial survival was about to be taught, and the student would learn that his teacher had saved the most devastating techniques for their final encounter. Chapter 15. The Ultimate Sacrifice. The blade that ended Agrippina's life entered her womb, the sacred place where she had carried the son who now commanded her death. "Strike here," she commanded Nicetus and his soldiers as they hesitated before the final act of matricide, her voice carrying the imperial authority that had never abandoned her even in the moment of ultimate defeat. "Strike the belly that bore Nero." With those words, the most dangerous woman in Roman history chose to transform her own murder into the ultimate curse upon the son who had betrayed everything she had taught him about the proper bonds between family members who shared divine blood. The morning had begun with Nero's final invitation, delivered with the courtesy appropriate for summoning one's mother to her execution. Agrippina had arrived at his villa near Baiae knowing that she walked towards certain death, but determined to ensure that her sacrifice would serve purposes that transcended mere survival. Dearest mother, Nero had greeted her with a smile that combined genuine affection with calculating satisfaction. How wonderful that you could join me for what I expect will be our most memorable conversation. The reunion had been carefully orchestrated to provide Nero with the psychological satisfaction of demonstrating his complete victory over the woman who had shaped his entire existence. They dined together, as they had countless times before, sharing wine and delicacies while discussing philosophy, politics, and the artistic projects that occupied Nero's increasingly grandiose imagination. But beneath the civilized surface, both participants understood that they were engaged in their final performance as mother and son, with each playing their role in a drama that could end only with the complete destruction of one protagonist by the other. "I've been thinking about legacy," Nero observed as they reclined together on the dining couches, his casual tone belying the significance of what he was revealing. "About what it means to transcend the limitations that constrain ordinary relationships and achieve something that approaches divine perfection." Agrippina recognized the philosophical framework he was constructing to justify matricide to himself, the same kind of intellectual rationalization she had once used to explain the necessity of eliminating inconvenient obstacles to her own ambitions. "And what conclusions have you reached about transcendence?" she asked, genuinely curious about how her son had resolved the psychological conflicts that matricide would necessarily create. "I've concluded that true divinity requires the courage to sacrifice everything human in service of something greater," Nero replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that revealed both his love for her and his determination to destroy that love in pursuit of absolute power. "Even the relationships that we treasure most must eventually be offered as sacrifices to our higher destiny." The conversation continued for hours as they explored together the philosophical justifications for what was about to occur. Both possessed sufficient intellectual sophistication to understand the historical significance of their relationship and the unprecedented nature of the resolution they were approaching. Never before in human history had two people who shared such profound intimacy and mutual understanding conspired together in the destruction of their bond through systematic application of the very techniques that had created their closeness. As evening approached, Nero's manner shifted from philosophical discussion to practical implementation of the assassination plan that had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. "I'm afraid our conversation has exhausted me more than I anticipated," he announced with the kind of false courtesy that had become their family's trademark method for concealing lethal intentions. "Perhaps you should retire to your chambers and rest before your journey back to Rome tomorrow." Both understood that there would be no journey back to Rome, no tomorrow, and no rest except the eternal sleep that awaited Agrippina in the chambers where Anicetus and his soldiers were already waiting with drawn swords. But as she rose to follow Nero's suggestion, Agrippina implemented the final phase of her own strategy, a psychological attack designed to plant seeds of guilt and self-destruction that would eventually consume her murderer even after her death. "Before I retire," she said, with the gentle tone she had once used to comfort him as a child, "I want you to know how proud I am of everything you've accomplished. You've exceeded every dream I had for your development, and you've become exactly what I always knew you could be." The words were chosen with surgical precision to create maximum psychological damage. By expressing pride in his achievements while knowing that he intended to murder her, she forced him to confront the fundamental contradiction between his love for her and his determination to destroy her. More devastatingly, by framing his matricidal intentions as the fulfillment of her hopes, rather than the betrayal of her trust, she made it impossible for him to view her elimination as liberation from maternal constraint. Instead, her death would represent the destruction of the one person whose approval had given meaning to all his accomplishments. "Thank you, Mother," Nero replied, his voice carrying the strain of someone struggling to maintain emotional equilibrium while implementing decisions that violated every instinct of human attachment. "Your guidance has indeed shaped me into what I've become." The exchange marked the end of their relationship and the beginning of Agrippina's final sacrifice, not just of her life, but of her son's psychological stability and long-term survival as emperor. When Anicetus and his soldiers entered her chambers with weapons drawn, Agrippina faced them with the same composure that had carried her through decades of imperial violence and political manipulation. "So this is how it ends," she observed. her voice carrying neither surprise nor fear, but rather the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had been confirmed by events. The student demonstrates his mastery by eliminating his teacher. But as the soldiers hesitated before the enormity of their task, killing the Empress Mother of Rome was unprecedented even in their experience of imperial violence. Agrippina seized control of her own death in ways that transformed murder into martyrdom. "If you've come to kill me," she declared with imperial authority that made hardened killers step backward involuntarily, "then do it properly. Strike the womb that bore such a monster. Let my death serve as testimony to what I created through my own ambitions." The command was simultaneously an acceptance of her fate and a final curse upon the son who had ordered her death. By directing the fatal blow to the source of Nero's physical existence, she ensured that her murder would be forever associated with the destruction of the maternal bond that had given him life. When Anicetus finally struck the killing blow, Agrippina died knowing that she had achieved a form of victory that transcended mere survival. Her death would become the catalyst for Nero's eventual destruction, triggering the psychological breakdown and political rebellion that would bring down the emperor who had dared to murder the woman who made his reign possible. The letters she had prepared were already being delivered throughout the empire, carrying documentation of Nero's crimes and commands for coordinated action against his authority. The conspirators she had organized were already moving to implement plans that would transform her martyrdom into the foundation for imperial revolution. Most importantly, the psychological seeds she had planted in Nero's mind during their final conversation were already beginning to germinate, creating guilt and self-doubt that would eventually consume his ability to function as emperor or human being. As her blood flowed across the marble floor of the chamber where she had planned so many other deaths, Agrippina's final thoughts were of satisfaction rather than regret. She had lived a life that exceeded every limitation imposed on women in the ancient world, had loved with intensity that transcended normal human categories, and had created something unprecedented in the long history of imperial power. Her son had indeed become exactly what she had shaped him to be, a monster capable of matricide in pursuit of absolute authority. But in becoming that monster, he had also guaranteed his own eventual destruction through the logical consequences of the techniques she had taught him. The ultimate sacrifice was complete. The most dangerous woman in Roman history had died as she had lived, transforming apparent defeat into victory through the sophisticated application of psychological warfare and political manipulation. Nero had won their final confrontation, but his victory would prove to be the beginning of a defeat so comprehensive that it would destroy not just his reign, but his sanity, his legacy, and ultimately his life. The Blood Princess had made her final move in the greatest game ever played, and even in death, she had ensured that checkmate belonged to her. The end thus concludes the twisted tale of Agrippina the Younger, the mother who slept with power itself and paid the ultimate price for her ambitions. Her death marked not just the end of a life, but the beginning of the end for the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Within 4 years of her murder, Nero's reign would collapse amid rebellion and chaos, his suicide bringing to a close the bloodiest chapter in Roman imperial history. Agrippina's legacy would endure not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition, but as proof that some individuals possess the rare combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and charisma necessary to reshape the course of human civilization, even when that reshaping requires the sacrifice of everything they hold most dear. In the blood-soaked annals of imperial Rome, there would never again be a story quite like hers, the mother who created a god and was destroyed by her own creation, but who ensured through her death that her victory would transcend the grave and reshape the empire she had fought so hard to control. Sweet dreams, and remember, the past is never as innocent as we pretend it to be. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey through history's most twisted family saga. If you enjoyed this series, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more shocking stories from the shadows of the past. What other historical figures would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember that behind every great empire lies a trail of blood, and behind every monster lies the person who taught them how to kill.